Welcome to Haven Stories channel. If you've ever spent a night out in the woods with only the walls of an RV between you and the darkness, you know how quickly the quiet can turn unsettling. Tonight's story takes us right into that kind of fear. Tree line shifted overnight, Bitterroot Forest dawn. I remember the silence before the dawn as clearly as I remember my own name. It wasn't the gentle silence of a forest sleeping, the kind that hums with crickets and distant owls. No, this was something else. It was an emptiness that pressed against my ears like the forest itself had stopped breathing. My name is Daniel Harker. I'm 41 years old, and I've lived most of my life under wide skies. Montana-born, raised on dirt roads and taught to respect both the kindness and cruelty of the land. I thought I knew the Bitterroot Mountains, thought I'd mapped their trails into my blood by the time I hit 30. But on that trip, what should have been a simple camping weekend, I learned that the forest can unmake every certainty you carry. It can shift the ground beneath your feet without leaving a mark, and it can teach you lessons that follow you long after you've hiked out. I had gone out alone, though my brother warned me not to. Too early in the season, he said. Snow's still melting, animals are unpredictable, and you know how it gets up there. He wasn't wrong. The higher trails and the Bitterroots hold on to winter like a grudge. Even when the valleys are blooming with lupine and wild geraniums, the ridges cling to frost, ice dripping from the stones in the shaded places. But I wasn't chasing flowers or snowmelt. I was chasing silence, my own silence. Life had been pulling at me in 1,000 directions, work fraying me thin, the loss of my father sitting heavy on my chest, and I thought a weekend under the tree line would steady me. It's funny how we imagine nature as a cure, when sometimes it's the very thing that breaks us open. I packed light, one-man tent, sleeping bag, stove, a bit of jerky, trail mix, and a notebook I'd promised myself I'd fill with thoughts I'd been avoiding. The trailhead at Painted Rocks was familiar. I parked the truck, checked my watch, and started up as dawn cut the night in half. The first hours were uneventful, just boots on damp soil, the creek talking low in the canyon, and the weight of spruce above me. Every so often I'd pause, not because I was tired, but because I wanted to listen. When you're alone out there, listening is survival. You don't just hear birdsong, you hear breaks in it. You hear the sudden hush when something larger than you moves unseen. You notice the way the wind bends a tree and how the rest of the forest reacts. Or doesn't. Every detail matters. By late afternoon, I'd found a flat shelf beneath a cluster of ponderosa pines, maybe 100 yards from the tree line where the ridge broke open toward bare rock. I set up my tent there, close enough to the trees for shelter, but not so deep that I'd be smothered in shade. The view was wide, the air sharp with snowmelt. It felt right. I cooked a small meal, read a few pages from my notebook, and tried to write something that felt true. The words came slow, halting. Maybe that was the first sign that something in me already knew I wouldn't be writing much more that night. The first unease came after dusk, when the forest should have shifted into its nighttime rhythm. Usually you hear the soft steps of deer, the flutter of bats, the distant call of coyotes if you're lucky. Instead, everything held back. The trees stood rigid against the twilight, and even the breeze seemed to skirt the ridge, unwilling to touch where I had laid my camp. I remember lying in my sleeping bag, headlamp still on, the canvas of the tent glowing dimly, and feeling like I was being listened to, not watched, listened to. As if every movement I made, every breath I took was being recorded by something old and patient. Sleep came in fragments. I must have dozed off because I woke to a sound at 2 a.m, a cracking not far off, like a branch breaking under weight. I held my breath. Another crack followed, closer, sharper. I reached for the hatchet I'd laid just inside the tent flap. My pulse thudded in my throat. Bears weren't unheard of, not up there. Mountain lions too, though they were ghosts compared to bears. I waited, listening. Nothing. Just the faint groan of trees leaning against each other in the dark. After 10 minutes, I convinced myself it was just snowmelt pushing debris downhill. I let my grip on the hatchet ease, though I never set it down. When dawn finally broke, I crawled out of the tent, shaking the stiffness from my legs. The world was pale blue, the sun not yet touching the peaks, mist lifting from the ground like breath. I stretched, turned toward the ridge, and froze. The tree line, the cluster of trees I'd set my camp beside, they weren't where they had been. I stood there, blinking, my mind fumbling for sense. The night before, the nearest spruce had been 20 feet from my tent, its trunk marked by a strip of peeled bark. Now that same tree stood closer, 10 feet, maybe less. I told myself it was a trick of the light, that I had misjudged distances in the fading dusk. But as I scanned the line, my chest tightened. It wasn't just one tree. The whole line of them seemed to have shifted, leaning toward me, creeping closer to the shelf where I'd camped. I walked the perimeter, counting steps, measuring space with my body the way I'd been taught as a kid. The numbers didn't lie. I wasn't imagining it. The forest had moved, or I had. But my tent was exactly where I'd left it, staked deep into the soil. The fire ring was there too, the stones undisturbed. Only the trees had changed. I stood there for what felt like an hour, circling, staring, trying to swallow the impossible. Rationality is a stubborn thing. It clings even when your senses are screaming otherwise. I told myself the shift was in my head, that fatigue and grief had scrambled my sense of space. But no matter how I spun it, the truth burned in my gut. The tree line was closer. Too close. And for the first time in years of backcountry camping, I didn't feel like I belonged out there. The forest, which had always been a quiet ally, had turned into something else. Something that wanted me small, unsettled, afraid. Still, pride has its grip. I didn't pack up, not yet. Instead, I forced myself through the motions of breakfast, boiling water, chewing granola I couldn't taste, pretending the morning was ordinary. But as the sun climbed and shadows stretched long across the ridge, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was waiting, that if I looked away too long, it would move again. I spent most of that morning pretending I wasn't shaken, pacing the ridge like a man with a purpose I didn't actually have. I jotted notes in the little leather journal, though the words were less about reflection and more about keeping my hands busy. Wind shifted east, I wrote. Ground soft near tree line. Pines. Leaning. That last word I underlined, then closed the book like I just committed something I wasn't ready to face. Denial is a strange survival instinct. It doesn't save you from anything. It just buys time until you can't look away anymore. Around noon, the sun finally broke fully over the peaks, and the snowpack up high began to sing. That's what I always called it, meltwater trickling down rock faces, streams swelling, the whole mountain alive with movement. But beneath that sound, I thought I caught something else, a low resonance, deep in the soil, like a hum you can't quite trace to any source. I knelt, pressing my palm to the ground as if I could feel it through the earth. Nothing, just cool dirt. But when I stood again, I swore the nearest spruce was closer still, its shadow cutting across the toe of my boot. I told myself I needed a distraction. Hiking further up the ridge would clear my head, give me perspective, maybe remind me I wasn't losing my mind. So I packed a small day bag, water, compass, knife, jerky, and left the tent staked where it was. As I climbed higher, I kept looking back, watching how the trees framed my little camp below. Each time I felt an unease, like their arrangement wasn't fixed, like they were holding their positions only while I was watching. By the time I reached the rocky lip above the tree line, my legs were trembling, though not from exertion. The view from up there should have steadied me. The Bitterroot Valley spread wide, green stitched with rivers, the horizon sharp under a pale sky. It was beautiful. It was everything I had come for. But all I could think about was how small my camp looked, dwarfed by those trees pressing up against it. I sat on the stone, trying to breathe, trying to convince myself that the world hadn't turned sideways overnight. I stayed until late afternoon, hoping that distance would reset my nerves. It didn't. If anything, the longer I stayed away, the more the anxiety gnawed at me, pulling me back down toward camp like a tether. When I returned, the sun was sinking. The air cooled fast, the kind of chill that tells you night will come quick and sharp. My tent looked undisturbed, gear where I left it. But the tree line, God, it was closer. No room left to deny it. The fire ring I'd built was nearly in shade now, though the sun hadn't yet dropped low enough to cast such a reach. The shadows came from the trees themselves, crowding, advancing. I dropped my bag and just stood there, every instinct screaming that I needed to leave. And yet, I didn't. You see, when you've spent your whole life in the backcountry, fear cuts both ways. There's the fear of staying, of confronting what doesn't make sense. And then there's the fear of leaving, of becoming the kind of man who runs from shadows, who can't trust his own eyes. Pride, stubbornness, call it what you will, it held me there. I gathered wood, sparked a fire, and forced myself to sit beside it, staring into the flames instead of the forest. The crackle of burning pine was a comfort, a sound I could measure, a rhythm that belonged to me. But the fire didn't erase the listening. That's the only way I can describe it, the sense that the forest was tuned to me, waiting for something. Each time the wind stirred, the branches barely moved, like the trees were holding themselves rigid so as not to break the silence. It was unbearable. So, I did what my father always taught me to do when fear threatened to hollow me out. I spoke aloud. "I don't know what you are," I said, voice steady against the dark. "But I'm here. I'm not moving." The words vanished into the stillness, absorbed like water into soil, and in the pause that followed, I felt foolish, a man talking to trees. But a deeper part of me knew it wasn't foolish at all. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in the tent with the hatchet in my hand, eyes wide, every sound magnified. The cracking came again, branches snapping, but never in sequence, never enough to pinpoint direction. Once I thought I saw movement through the nylon wall, a shape tall and narrow, but when I ripped the zipper open, there was nothing. Nothing but the smell of resin and damp earth and the oppressive certainty that the trees had crept even closer. By 3 a.m., I was trembling, not from cold, but from the weight of it, from the knowledge that dawn might not change anything this time. And I was right. When the sky lightened to gray and I finally crawled out, the camp was swallowed. The tree line wasn't a line anymore. It was a wall, trunks pressed nearly against the tent, branches weaving overhead like a cage. The open shelf I'd chosen was gone, erased, reclaimed. I stood there barefoot in the dirt, dizzy with disbelief. The forest had moved in the night, and it had taken me with it. I don't think my body understood what my mind was processing. My hands were shaking, my chest tight, but my feet stayed rooted to the earth as though I was tethered to those trees. The rational part of me, the one that had packed maps, checked weather reports, calculated calories, was screaming to break camp and get out. But there was another part, quieter, older, that told me if I turned my back, the forest would close behind me and I'd never find my way out. That if I fled in panic, I'd be running straight into whatever had decided to move those trees. So I did what seemed unthinkable. I stayed put. I packed nothing. I didn't reach for my gear. I just stood there among the pines that had crept in around me and forced myself to breathe slow, to notice everything. Their bark was damp with morning mist, beads of water sliding down in silence. The smell of sap was overwhelming, thick as syrup in the air. The ground was soft under my boots, too soft, as if the roots beneath had stirred in the night, breaking the soil apart from within. The strangest thing was the absence of marks, no tracks, no signs of trees being dragged or pushed. They simply were, as though they had always been there, their roots sunk deep long before I was born. And yet I knew, they hadn't been standing there yesterday. By noon, I was unraveling. The fire I'd built had burned to ash, and I couldn't bring myself to relight it. My journal sat unopened, the pen beside it, but my hands wouldn't move to write. What was I supposed to record? That the world had shifted around me? That the map in my head no longer matched the ground under my feet? How do you write down proof of madness? The hours stretched. Every time I tried to walk out of camp, I found myself circling back to the same clearing. Once I marched straight in one direction, counting steps, refusing to glance over my shoulder. When I finally allowed myself to look back, the tent was still there, directly behind me, as if I hadn't moved at all. My legs were aching, my throat raw from breathing hard, but I hadn't gone anywhere. The forest folded around me like a hand closing around a stone. That was when the fear turned into something sharper. Not just dread, but anger. Anger at myself for ignoring my brother's warning. Anger at the land I had trusted my whole life. It was like anger at the invisible force that was bending reality until I didn't know which way was up. I remember shouting into the trees, my voice cracking, "What do you want from me?" The silence after was so complete it felt like I'd swallowed it. And then came the sound, low, vibrating. Not in the air, but in my chest, in my ribs. A resonance that was less heard than felt. It was like the hum of power lines, except there were no lines, no machines, nothing man-made within miles. I dropped to my knees without realizing it, palms pressed into the dirt. The vibration thrummed up through the ground into my bones as if the forest itself was answering me. I don't know how long I knelt there. Minutes. Hours. Time was stripped of meaning. When the vibration faded, I was left in a silence so heavy it crushed me flat. And in that silence, a thought settled in my head, clear, undeniable. If I wanted to leave, I had to give something up. Not gear, not food. Something deeper. Something I'd carried into these woods that didn't belong. I thought of my father then, of the months I'd spent avoiding his death, of the guilt that gnawed at me because I hadn't been there when he passed. I thought of the anger I carried like a stone in my chest, anger that I masked as control, as planning, as competence. I thought of all the ways I'd come into this forest, demanding it heal me without offering anything in return. And for the first time in years, I let myself weep. Not quietly, not the kind of tears you can swallow and hide, but raw, body-breaking sobs that left me heaving against the soil. When the last of it left me, I was empty, hollow in a way that felt clean, not broken. I pressed my forehead against the ground and whispered the only thing I had left, "I'm sorry." The air shifted. A breeze, sudden and sharp, swept through the clearing, carrying with it the scent of pine needles, wild earth, and snow. I lifted my head. The trees no longer pressed against me. They were where they had been when I first pitched camp, 20 feet back, bark striped with familiar marks. The wall of trunks had receded, like a tide pulling back to sea. My tent stood alone again in an open shelf of earth. I stumbled to my feet, unsteady, afraid to blink in case it was an illusion. But it wasn't. The forest had returned to what it was. Or maybe I had returned to what I was meant to be. I packed in silence, folded the tent, shouldered the bag, doused the ash with the last of my water. When I stepped back onto the trail, the path was there, steady under my boots, as though it had never been lost. I didn't look back. Not once. It wasn't until I reached the truck at Painted Rocks that I realized the notebook was still in my pocket. I pulled it out, opened it, and saw the last line I had written the day before. Pines, leaning. Beneath it, in my own handwriting, a line I don't remember writing. The forest waits until you're ready to see it. To this day, I don't know if I wrote those words in some half-conscious haze, or if the forest wrote through me. All I know is that I left something behind on that ridge, and in return, it let me go. I drove home with my hands gripping the wheel tighter than they needed to. Every bend of the mountain road seemed to echo with the silence I had left behind. The radio stayed off, and for once I didn't crave distraction. My mind kept circling back to the moment the tree line had swallowed my camp, how it had felt not like an attack, but a demand, an invitation into something I wasn't prepared to face. I realized then that the forest had never meant to destroy me. It had meant to strip me down, to force me to see the weight I'd been carrying, the grief I refused to put down. When I reached cell service, my phone lit up with messages from my brother. Missed calls, voicemails. I didn't answer, not yet. I wasn't ready to talk about what had happened because the truth sounded like madness when spoken out loud. How do you explain that a forest moved around you, that trees shifted overnight, not in inches, but in yards, that roots seemed to curl into your chest and demand you give up the pain you had buried there? People don't believe those kinds of stories. They file them under hallucination, stress, dehydration, and maybe it was all those things. But I know what I lived through. For days afterward, I walked around with that notebook in my pocket, unable to let it out of my sight. I'd flip to the last page, trace my finger over the words I didn't remember writing. The forest waits until you're ready to see it. Each time, it sent a chill down my spine. Not fear, but recognition, like I had been carrying a truth inside me for years, and only the forest had the strength to draw it out. Nights became the hardest. I would wake at 2 or 3 in the morning, the same hours when the trees had crept closer, and listen to the silence outside my house. Even in the suburbs, silence has layers. You can tell when the neighborhood sleeps easy, and you can tell when it's holding its breath. More than once, I caught myself stepping outside barefoot, standing on the cold grass, staring at the shadowed outline of the trees at the edge of my property. Part of me feared they would move again, just as they had in Bitterroot. Another part of me hoped they would, because as terrifying as that night had been, it had left me more alive than I'd felt in years. Weeks passed before I finally told my brother. We were sitting on his porch, the evening thick with the smell of rain. I laid it out plain, no embellishment, no attempt to soften the edges. I told him the tree line had shifted, that I had been trapped, tested, and that the only thing that freed me was surrender. He didn't laugh. He didn't tell me I was crazy. He just nodded, slow, like he'd heard something similar once before, but never dared to say it out loud. After a long silence, he said, "Dad always told us the mountains take what they're owed. Maybe you finally paid your debt." That line lodged itself deep inside me. A debt. Maybe that was it. Maybe grief itself is a debt, one we try to outrun until the land itself stops us. Maybe we only move forward when we stop fighting the weight and set it down among the roots. The months since have been different. I don't step into the woods with the same hunger I used to. I step in with caution, with respect, with a readiness to listen. When I set up camp now, I speak aloud, soft words of thanks like I'm addressing an old friend. I don't ask for healing anymore. I just ask for honesty, even if it cuts, and somehow that honesty has changed me more than comfort ever could. People sometimes ask why I keep going back after something like that. Why not give up the mountains, give up the trees, stay safe on paved roads and in warm houses? The answer is simple, because the forest doesn't lie. It doesn't dress itself up to make you feel better. It doesn't soothe your wounds with cheap words. It shows you exactly where you stand, and sometimes it shifts the ground to prove it. That's a kind of truth you can't find in the world we've built with glass and screens and noise. I don't know if the Bitterroot Forest will ever test me again. Maybe it won't need to. Maybe once was enough. But I carry its lesson with me, that silence isn't emptiness, that fear isn't always danger, and that some things only reveal themselves when we're stripped of pride. So, if you ever find yourself alone in the deep woods and the trees seem to lean closer than they should, don't be so quick to run. Don't be so quick to call it madness. Ask yourself what you've brought with you that doesn't belong. Ask yourself what you're clinging to that the forest wants you to lay down. And if you're lucky, or if you're ready, you just might hear the answer in the hum beneath your feet, because the forest waits. It always waits, and it will move for you when the time comes. There are nights, even now, when I wake up and feel that same old pull, like the roots beneath my house are whispering through the floorboards. I'll lie there, staring at the ceiling, hearing nothing but the stillness, and then I'll remember the Bitterroot Forest at dawn, how the air seemed to hold its breath, how the line of pines had crept forward until they stood over me like judges. That memory is sharper than any dream. It isn't something I can shake. But instead of fear, it brings a strange comfort because it reminds me that I am not untouchable. that the world is larger than my grief, larger than my control, larger than me. It's easy in our lives to think we're the ones moving through the land, that it is static, fixed, and we are the wanderers. But out there, I learned something else. The land moves through us. The forest shifts. The mountains breathe. The rivers remember. And if you aren't willing to be shaped by them, then you have no business being out there. The wilderness doesn't care about your schedules, your plans, your intentions. It doesn't bend to your will. It bends you. When I tell this story, people often ask, do you really believe the trees moved? I always answer the same. They moved enough. Whether they crept in like living things or whether they exposed how fragile my own perception was, doesn't matter. What matters is that I was forced to confront the truth I'd been avoiding. I walked into those woods thinking I could outrun the ache of losing my father, thinking solitude would patch over the raw places inside me. Instead, the forest boxed me in until there was nowhere left to turn but inward. It didn't let me hide. It demanded I see myself clearly. And once I did, it set me free. That's the part that lingers. The forest doesn't waste its time teaching you lessons you don't need. If it confronts you, it's because you've carried something too long, something it won't allow on its soil. Some people experience it as bad luck. Others call it superstition. But if you've ever been alone out there long enough, you know the line between superstition and truth is as thin as the mist at dawn. I tell you this not to frighten you away from camping, not to scare you out of the woods. If anything, I tell you because I hope you go. I hope you stand beneath towering pines and feel how small you are. I hope you lie awake at night listening, not just for danger, but for what the silence is saying. Because if you let it, the wilderness will strip you of the noise you carry, all the masks and shields until you're nothing but yourself. It will test you, and if you pass, if you're willing to surrender, it will give you back more than you ever expected. The Bitterroot Forest taught me that we don't walk alone, no matter how deep we go into the wild. We carry our past, our grief, our ghosts, and sometimes the land decides it's time to set them down. You may think you're going into the woods to find peace, but peace isn't given. It's earned, and it's earned by surrendering what you're not strong enough to carry anymore. So the next time you shoulder your pack, the next time you strike out on a trailhead at dawn, remember this: the forest is listening. Not in the way a neighbor listens through thin walls, but in the way an old friend listens, with patience, with weight, with silence that won't let you lie. If you feel the trees pressing closer, if you feel the ground hum beneath your boots, don't run. Don't fight it. Stand still. Breathe. Listen. And ask yourself what it wants you to see. Because sometimes the tree line really does shift overnight. And when it does, it isn't to trap you. It's to show you that the world is alive, that you are alive, and that the two are bound together in ways no map, no compass, no piece of logic can explain. And if you're ready, the forest will let you go. Changed, lighter, wiser. Not untouched, never untouched, but more whole than when you arrived. There is something I've carried ever since that trip, something that feels less like memory and more like an imprint. When I walk beneath trees now, whether in a city park or on a country road lined with cottonwoods or deep in the canyons of Montana, I watch how they stand. I watch their posture, their silence, the way they lean together like they're conspiring. And I remind myself they are not just backdrop. They are not props in the story of my life. They are part of the story itself. Most people don't see it. They march into the woods as if it's theirs to conquer. They cut trails, mark paths, set up fires, and leave their trash behind as though the land is just a stage for their little adventure. But if you've ever felt the forest shift beneath your feet, you know better. You know the woods are not passive. They're active. They're waiting. And sometimes, only sometimes, they decide to reveal themselves. What happened to me in Bitterroot could have been a hallucination, sure. It could have been grief, exhaustion, a trick of the senses. But that doesn't explain the way my body remembers it more vividly than it remembers birthdays, names, dates. That doesn't explain the way my brother looked at me when I told him, as if something in him had always known the land could do that, but he'd never dared say it. Some truths don't need scientific proof. They're etched into you by experience, carved into your bones so deep you can't deny them. And the truth is this: the wilderness changes you, not always in ways you ask for, not always gently. Sometimes it shows you what you fear most. Sometimes it corners you until the only way out is through your own surrender. That's not cruelty, it's honesty. And honesty is a gift most of us spend our whole lives avoiding. I remember a line my father used to say whenever he took us camping as kids. We'd be crouched by a fire, the night thick around us, and he'd say, "Remember, this place doesn't care about you. That's why you have to care about it." At the time, I thought he meant safety. Don't get careless, don't leave food out, don't forget that a bear won't think twice about you. But now I hear something deeper in those words. The forest doesn't care in the way a storm doesn't care, in the way the ocean doesn't care. It exists beyond our need for comfort. That doesn't make it hostile, it makes it real. And if you care about it, it just might let you glimpse something greater than yourself. That's why I keep going back, not because I want another encounter like the one I had that was more than enough for one lifetime, but because I want to keep listening. I want to keep walking into the silence with humility, knowing I may be tested again, or maybe not at all. The lesson is in being ready either way. And I'll tell you this, when you're out there, when you've hiked past the last echo of roads and people, when the stars cut sharp above you and the ground hums low beneath your boots, don't mistake your solitude for being alone. You're not. The land is alive in ways we don't have words for. The mountains are listening. The trees are shifting. The rivers are carrying stories older than any of us. If you listen, really listen, you'll feel it. And it will feel you. The Bitterroot Forest reminded me that fear is not the enemy. Fear is a compass. It points us to where we need to pay attention, to the truths we've tried to bury. If you feel that fear in the woods, don't dismiss it. Let it guide you. Ask yourself, what is this place trying to teach me? What part of myself have I been refusing to face? I can't promise you the forest will always answer, but sometimes, when the time is right, it will. It might come in a whisper of wind through the pines. It might come in the crack of a branch when there's no animal in sight. Or it might come in the impossible, the tree line shifting overnight, pressing in until you have no choice but to lay your burdens down. And if that day comes for you, I hope you don't run. I hope you don't let pride trick you into thinking you're in control. I hope you stop, breathe, and listen. Because what the forest offers isn't destruction, it's transformation. And if you let it, you'll walk out changed. Maybe lighter, maybe wiser, maybe more whole than you've been in years. I walked out of Bitterroot with less than I carried in, less anger, less grief, less of the illusion that I was bigger than the land hand that held me. And I count that as a gift, a hard gift, but a gift all the same. So if you ever find yourself in that silence before dawn, standing at the edge of a tree line that seems closer than it should be, remember this: the wilderness doesn't play tricks. It doesn't waste its time. It shows you exactly what you're ready to see. And when it moves for a reason. The wind in the mountains carries secrets that no map, no ranger, no trail marker will ever warn you about. And on that night, at exactly 12:17 a.m., it carried the sound of crying. My name is Daniel, 34 years old, a man who spent more nights under canvas or steel than inside 4 solid walls. I'd chosen the Rocky Mountains for their brutal beauty, for the kind of silence that reminds you the world is bigger than your fears. But silence in the Rockies is a deceptive thing. It doesn't hold forever. It waits, patient as stone, and then when you least expect it, it breaks into something you cannot unhear, something you can't outrun. I had driven up in my old camper, the kind that shudders with every bend in the mountain road, its cabinets rattling, its engine gasping thin breaths in the altitude. The sky had been bruised with violet clouds when I pulled into a clearing just wide enough to park. The air was sharp with pine resin, and snow melt trickled over rocks in hidden streams below. I remember thinking how alive the wilderness felt that evening, how the wind came down in sheets, bending the treetops like bowing supplicants. I'd been camping in the Rockies before, but never this high, never this far from the roads where even locals refused to linger after dusk. There was a small town, 30 miles down the switchbacks, where I'd stopped earlier that day to pick up supplies. The man at the counter of the general store, wrinkled, with a face that looked carved from the same granite as the cliffs, had asked me where I was headed. When I told him, he went quiet, bagging my groceries without another word. His silence lingered, heavy, and when I pressed him, he only said, "Be careful after midnight. The wind carries more than weather up there." I laughed it off, the way a traveler laughs at local superstition, not realizing then that superstition is often just survival in disguise. By nightfall, the fire I'd built was the only light within miles. Shadows stretched long and thin, reaching toward me with every gust of wind. I cooked a simple meal on the grate: beans, sausage, the kind of food that tastes better when the smoke settles into it, and leaned back against the bumper of my camper, watching the stars come out. The Rockies always give you more sky than you think you can handle, as if the earth itself falls away and leaves you floating beneath a sea of stars. I should have felt comfort in that vastness, but instead it pressed down, a weight of silence broken only by the occasional crack of shifting timber or the distant hoot of an owl. I had just doused the fire to embers when the wind shifted. It wasn't the usual mountain current that claws at your jacket and chills your bones. It came in slow, steady, almost deliberate, carrying with it a sound that froze me where I stood. It was faint at first, a tremor at the edge of hearing, but unmistakable. Someone was crying. Not the muffled sob of grief you might overhear through a wall, not the exaggerated wail of a child, but a thin, aching cry that seemed carried directly into my ear by the breath of the mountain. I stood there, every hair on my arms rising, my body trying to decide whether to move toward the sound or away from it. The rational part of me whispered explanations. An animal caught in the brush, the wind funneling through rock in just the right way to mimic a voice, or even some other camper out there, lost and in need of help. But deeper down, beneath rationality, something inside me recoiled. That cry wasn't searching for help. It was searching for someone to hear it. And I had heard it. I pulled my jacket tighter and grabbed my headlamp, sweeping its beam over the trees. The forest swallowed the light. Every trunk was a black pillar, every shadow a possibility. The crying rose and fell with the wind, sometimes near, sometimes far, as though it were circling the clearing. I called out, a mistake, though I didn't know it then. "Hello? Do you need help?" My voice felt thin, ridiculous against the vastness of the night. The wind paused, almost holding its breath, and for a heartbeat there was only silence. Then, clearer than before, the crying started again, closer, weaving through the pines. Something shifted inside me. Fear, yes, but also a strange pull, a compulsion to follow. That was the dilemma, clawing at me even as my instincts screamed to stay put. I wanted to believe I was the kind of man who helped, who didn't leave someone alone in the cold dark. I wanted to believe that I could walk toward that sound and find a person, fragile but real, not something the wind had shaped into human sorrow. My boots crunched the frost-hardened ground as I stepped beyond the fire's glow, and each step felt like choosing a side in a battle I didn't fully understand. The crying led me downhill, toward a stand of aspens whose pale trunks gleamed ghostly under the starlight. I could hear water rushing somewhere below, a creek swollen from snowmelt. My breath puffed white in the beam of my headlamp, and still the sound carried, always just ahead, always just out of reach. "Hello?" I called again, softer now, as though afraid of being heard too clearly. No answer, just that steady thread of weeping unraveling through the dark. The ground grew steeper, littered with fallen branches that snagged at my pants. The trees thinned, opening onto a narrow ledge that overlooked the valley below. The wind struck hard there, lifting my hood, biting at my face, and with it came the crying. Louder now, yet still no figure to claim it. The sound wrapped around me, filling my chest with something that wasn't just fear. It was grief, deep and raw, seeping into me as though the wind had found a way to plant sorrow directly into my bones. I stood on that ledge, my light trembling in my hand, and asked myself the question I hadn't dared put into words. If I keep following this sound, will I find someone, or will I lose myself? My knees locked on that ledge as if the mountain itself had rooted me there, and I knew that if I leaned too far forward, I'd tumble into the valley where no one would ever find me. The crying clung to the wind, weaving in and out like smoke. I told myself again that it had to be someone real, someone alive. Maybe a hiker separated from their group. Maybe a kid, though what kid would be wandering the Rockies at midnight? But every rational explanation crumbled under the weight of that sound. It wasn't desperation in those cries. It wasn't fear. It was longing. And longing can be more dangerous than rage. I turned my light down the path that curved along the ridgeline, hoping to spot movement, but the beam caught only the swaying white bark of aspens and the black cavern of night between them. My own breath sounded too loud in my ears. I forced myself to take another step, the crunch of frost under my boots snapping through the silence. The crying fell quiet for just a moment as though listening, and then it started again, this time not ahead but behind me. I spun, headlamp beam slicing across trunks, branches, mist. The firelight from my clearing was nowhere in sight now. I'd gone farther than I realized. My chest tightened with the sudden awareness that I wasn't just chasing the sound. I was being led. And the path wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to something else. I froze, debating whether to run back uphill. My heart thudded hard enough to shake my whole body. Then, through the branches, I saw it. A flicker of white between the trees, gone as soon as my light landed, too fast, too pale to be clothing. Maybe snow caught in the air? I tried to convince myself, but the thought felt hollow. The crying came again, impossibly close, no longer drifting. It was right there. Who's out here? My voice cracked, raw with both fear and determination. The crying stopped, and in that moment of silence, the wind carried a different sound, my name. Daniel. Not shouted, not spoken, but breathed, as if the mountain itself exhaled it through the trees. I staggered back a step, knees weak. No one in this wilderness knew my name, no one but me. And still it came again, more insistent, carried by air so thin it cut my throat. Daniel. The sound wasn't sharp, it wasn't threatening. It was soft, imploring, as if someone familiar were calling me home. But familiarity in the dark can be a trap. I knew that, deep down, even as every part of me wanted to step closer. The dilemma grew sharper than the cold. Should I flee, abandoning the chance that maybe, just maybe, someone real needed me? Or should I keep moving toward the sound, risking whatever waited at the end of it? The man at the general store flashed in my memory, his silence when I told him where I was headed, his warning, be careful after midnight. I understood it now, too late. The wind wasn't carrying weather, it was carrying me. The trees groaned, as if shifting closer, their pale trunks forming a cage. I pressed forward, headlamp beam shaking, until the trail widened slightly and spilled into another clearing. The ground was bare except for a scattering of stones arranged in a circle, so deliberate that no storm could have placed them that way. In the center of that ring, the sound came alive, crying so real, so near, I almost dropped to my knees. I swept the beam across the stones, expecting, no, dreading, to see a figure curled in the dirt. But there was nothing, just empty earth. Still the crying didn't stop. It reverberated inside the circle, echoing without a mouth, without a body. I stepped closer, pulse hammering. The air in the circle seemed thicker, colder, as though the world itself bent inward. Then a gust tore through the clearing as scared, knocking my hood back, and the crying shifted again, transforming into laughter. Not joyous laughter, not even cruel, just hollow, broken, like the sound of someone remembering what it meant to be human. My light flickered, dimming though the batteries were full. The ring of stones glowed faintly in reflection, as if catching starlight the sky wasn't offering. I stumbled back, my boots scraping against rock, and the sound cut off. Dead silence. The kind of silence that screams louder than any noise. For the first time since leaving my fire, I realized I was trembling, every muscle in my arms quivering as if the air itself had weight. My instincts finally roared louder than my doubt. I needed to leave. Now. I turned, retracing my path uphill, heart clawing against my ribs, but the trail no longer looked the same. The aspens leaned in unfamiliar angles, the creek's sound had vanished, and the stars above seemed to have shifted places. Each step felt like sinking into a maze with no end. The wind rose again, brushing my ears with whispers, fragments of crying and laughter braided together, all of it circling my name. Daniel. Daniel. I ran then, no longer caring if I slipped or broke an ankle, no longer caring what direction I took. Branches snapped against my arms, roots caught my boots, but I pushed, gasping for air that didn't want to fill my lungs. My headlamp beam swung wildly, and just when despair sank its claws, I caught sight of orange glow through the trees. My fire. My camp. Bursting into the clearing, I fell against the bumper of my camper, chest heaving, eyes burning. The embers of the fire still pulsed weakly, waiting. Behind me, the crying didn't follow. The wind dropped to a whisper. The silence returned. But now I knew silence in the Rockies is never empty. It's only waiting for the next 12:17 a.m. I collapsed onto the cold earth, the metal of the camper biting against my back, as though to remind me I was still anchored to something real. My lungs strained to steady themselves, each breath dragging sharp air that burned down into my chest. The fire's faint glow threw long, spidery shadows across the clearing, and for a while I convinced myself that maybe I'd outrun it, that maybe the crying had been nothing more than a trick of altitude, of isolation, of a tired mind convincing itself of danger. But the Rockies don't let you dismiss what they've shown you, not when the clock keeps its own time, and not when the night itself waits like a predator. I checked my watch, the faint green numbers blinking 12:31 a.m., 14 minutes since it had begun. The number sat in my head like a curse. I told myself I'd stay awake until dawn, that sleep was too dangerous, but exhaustion has a way of finding cracks in your resolve. I fed the fire, hands shaking as I stacked branches, coaxing the flames higher, needing the light to prove I wasn't swallowed whole. The crackle of the fire drowned the ringing in my ears for a while, and I leaned into its warmth like a man starved. That was when the wind returned. Not as a gale, not even as a strong current, but as a whisper that curled into the flames. It was subtle at first, lifting the smoke in strange spirals, pressing the fire to bend sideways, and then, in that bending, came the sound again. Not crying this time, breathing. The kind of breath that hovers just behind your neck, just close enough to remind you that you're not alone. I froze, poker in hand, my body going rigid as the fire hissed against the wind. The breath followed no rhythm of lungs, no rise and fall of chest. It was endless, steady, a constant exhale weaving around me, pushing my jacket against my skin. My instincts screamed, "Don't turn. Don't give it the satisfaction of being seen." But I had to know. My headlamp still clung to my forehead, and I flicked it on with trembling fingers, the beam cutting the clearing. Nothing. Just trees, just dark, just the trembling outline of my camper. Yet the breath continued, brushing against my ear, feather light. I spun the beam in a full circle, heart hammering, and that's when I saw them. Indentations forming in the frost, as if invisible feet pressed the earth. One after another, deliberate, slow, edging closer to the fire. The ground gave way without a weight to cause it. My pulse thrashed in my skull. I shouted then, not out of bravery but pure survival, "Stop!" The word tore from my throat like it belonged to someone else. For a heartbeat, everything obeyed. The wind fell silent, the fire straightened, the footprints froze. And then came the answer, so quiet I almost doubted it, carried in that same impossible breath. Daniel. I stumbled backward, hitting the side of the camper, my hand fumbling for the door handle. My body screamed to get inside, to lock the world out with a thin sheet of metal. But another part of me, that stubborn streak of pride, whispered that maybe if I showed fear, it would grow bolder. That maybe what it wanted wasn't just to be heard. It wanted to see me break. So I stayed by the fire, chest heaving, eyes locked on the frost as the indentations retreated, one by one, vanishing back toward the tree line. The breath dissolved into the night, and the silence that replaced it was somehow worse. Because silence can be filled with anything your mind dares to create. Hours dragged. The fire dwindled despite my best efforts. I sat there with my back to the camper, head nodding against my will, fighting sleep. And when my eyes finally shut for a moment, it was the crying that pulled me back. Faint, far, but returning. My watch read 3:07 a.m. Not the cursed 12:17, a different hour, a different rule. The wind was no longer bound to its time. It had found me, and now it could come whenever it wished. This time, the crying didn't drift. It didn't weave through trees or play with distance. It came from inside the camper. My chest clenched so tight I couldn't breathe. I spun, the door a few feet away, light flickering against its thin metal surface. I heard it clearly now. Muffled sobs, low and broken, filling the small hollow space where I'd left my sleeping bag and stove. Every instinct I had told me not to open that door, not to invite whatever was in there further into my world. But it was my camper. My last refuge. If I didn't claim it, I had nothing left. I reached for the handle, the cold steel burning my palm. The sobbing quieted, as if whoever or whatever was inside knew I was listening. My throat tightened, words catching before I could speak. And then, in the faintest, most human whisper, a voice from inside said, "Please don't leave me alone again." The dilemma split me down the middle. Was it an echo of someone who'd truly been lost here, a soul tethered to these ridges, begging for the company they'd never had at the end? Or was it a lure, crafted perfectly to unravel the last of my defenses? My hand trembled on the handle, the firelight at my back guttering low. I knew then that the mountain didn't want me to run. It wanted me to decide. The handle was icy beneath my hand, as though the metal had been sitting in shadow all day despite the firelight dancing against it. My knuckles whitened, the decision pressing heavier than the mountain air itself. On one side of that thin sheet of steel, my gear, my bed, the last fragile illusion of safety. On the other side, something that had already learned my name, already mimicked sorrow, already crept into the one place I swore would remain mine. The voice came again, softer, almost choked. "Please, don't leave me alone again. Not a demand, a plea." And that was the knife twisted deepest. It didn't sound monstrous. It sounded human. Like someone who had been left out here to freeze, someone abandoned by the world, someone whose grief had soaked so deep into the rock and pine that the wind carried it still. That whisper touched something inside me I didn't want to admit. My own memories of being left, of nights when silence pressed too heavy and all I wanted was another voice. The Rockies had dug into that vulnerability, and now they were holding it against me. My breath fogged against the door, shallow and uneven. I closed my eyes and told myself, if I open it, I might lose myself. If I don't, I'll never know what waits in there, and maybe I'll never reclaim the one space left that belongs to me. It wasn't curiosity alone pulling me toward it. It was defiance. I wanted to prove that this thing, whatever it was, couldn't dictate where I stood, couldn't decide my fear for me. I twisted the handle. The door swung open with a metallic groan, hinges stiff from the cold. My headlamp beam cut into the camper's interior, illuminating the narrow bed, the folded blanket, the stainless steel pot still sitting on the counter. Everything was as I'd left it. Empty. Too empty. But the air inside wasn't still. It pulsed as if the walls themselves were breathing. And from the farthest corner, deep in the shadows beneath the bed, came the sound. Not crying anymore. Not laughter. Breathing. Slow, steady, synchronized with my own, until I couldn't tell which breath belonged to me. I stepped inside, each creak of the floor magnified in my ears. The door swung shut behind me with a hollow thud, plunging the clearing outside into silence. I told myself to check the corner, to aim the light directly beneath the bed, but my hand refused to obey. Instead, the beam quivered over the walls, catching scraps of condensation, droplets clinging where no rain had fallen. My watch ticked 3:12. Each second carried the weight of a choice I couldn't undo. "Who are you?" My voice was low, rough, almost lost in the rhythm of breathing. For a moment there was nothing, only the faint hiss of my own lungs. Then the whisper unfurled again, so close I swore it came from my own mouth. "You left me here." Ice surged through my veins. I had never been here before this trip. I had never left anyone. Yet the voice carried a certainty, an accusation that slid under my skin like a hook. My beam jerked downward, finally pinning the dark space beneath the bed, and I saw eyes, not glowing, not animal, human. Wide, wet, glistening with a pain so raw it stole the air from my chest. They blinked once, slow, half as if they hadn't seen light in years. I stumbled back, colliding with the counter, my lamp beam stuttering across the cramped interior. The eyes didn't move closer, but the breathing filled the space, louder now, rattling the thin walls. "You're not real," I whispered, trying to convince myself. But even as the words left me, I felt how hollow they were. Real or not, it had me cornered. The camper groaned, not from the wind outside, but from something inside pressing outward. The metal frame shivered, rivets creaking. My name came again, layered this time, as if more than one voice spoke through the same throat. Daniel. The sound made my vision blur, my pulse hammer so violently I thought my ribs might splinter. I lunged for the door, fumbling with the handle, yanking it open so hard it slammed against the siding. Cold air rushed in, scattering the suffocating breath. I stumbled into the clearing, fire down to embers, night thick as ink. Behind me, the camper door creaked shut on its own, sealing whatever waited inside. The crying did not follow. I collapsed by the fire, clutching the earth with both hands to remind myself it was still solid. The wind circled the clearing, brushing pine needles, but it carried no sound. For now. My watch read 3:19 a.m. The rules had changed again. It wasn't bound to 12:17. It wasn't bound to time at all. The Rockies had claimed me, and I understood. Once the mountain knows your name, it never forgets. The embers pulsed faintly, red veins glowing in the ash, but they gave off no warmth. My body shook with cold and exhaustion, yet I didn't dare close my eyes. Every time my lids flickered shut, I saw those eyes again. Wet, human, unblinking, beneath the bed of my camper. The mountain hadn't just shown me something. It had tied a knot between my fear and its voice, and now every shift of wind felt like it could unravel me. The hours crawled, measured not by sleep or silence, but by the sound of the forest holding its breath. I watched the stars wheel across the ink-black sky, their movement too slow to comfort me. When at last a thin smear of pale light bled along the ridgeline, I almost wept. Dawn, I thought. Salvation. But the Rockies don't forgive that easily. As the fire died, the wind began to pick up again. Not fierce, not violent, but steady, intentional. It slithered through the clearing, brushing ash into patterns on the ground. At first, I thought they were random swirls, but then the shapes took form, curves, lines, letters. My name, over and over, written in ash. Daniel. The mountain wasn't done with me. It wasn't enough that I had heard it. It wanted me marked. I staggered to my feet, legs stiff, mind frayed. The camper loomed at the edge of the clearing, its windows dark, its thin frame silent. I knew what waited inside, or at least I knew what it wanted me to believe waited inside. And still, some stubborn part of me whispered, if you leave it behind, it follows. If you face it, maybe you end it. The choice bore down heavy, stay and confront it in daylight, or leave this place forever, knowing I'd never drive far enough to outrun a voice carried by the wind. My hands shook as I fumbled through my pack, fingers closing around the can of fuel I kept for emergencies. If the camper was no longer mine, then it was bait. A snare the Rockies had built to keep me tethered. And snares can be burned. I doused the sides in fuel, the acrid smell rising sharp in the morning chill. My heart pounded as I struck a match, flame trembling in the dawn. For a breathless second, I hesitated, Burning it meant destroying the one safe place I had, the only shelter for miles. But leaving it meant carrying that presence inside me forever. The whisper came again, faint through the door, "Don't leave me alone again." The match dropped. Flame raced up the siding, licking across windows, chewing into the thin metal frame. The camper screamed, not the metal, not the fire, but a sound that tore from inside, rising in pitch until it pierced the sky. It wasn't crying anymore. It was rage. A chorus of voices, layered and raw, the mountain itself howling at me. I stumbled back, shielding my face from the heat, the fire roaring higher than any fuel should have allowed. The wind whipped around me, carrying those voices, trying to push me toward the flames as though to force me back inside. But I held my ground. My name shrieked in the gale, distorted, furious. And then, as the roof caved in, it stopped. The breath vanished. The wind fell silent. Only the crackle of fire remained, the camper collapsing inward until nothing was left but a charred frame and blackened earth. Dawn broke fully then, sunlight spilling over the ridges, turning the smoke gold. I sank to my knees, the cold earth steady beneath me, and for the first time since 12:17 a.m., I heard only my own breath. I thought maybe I'd won. Maybe I'd severed the knot. But as the smoke drifted upward, carried east across the mountains, I realized something that froze me colder than the night ever had. The wind doesn't die in the Rockies. It only carries what it has been given. And now it carried me. I left that clearing at sunrise, every step down the switchbacks heavy with the knowledge that my name was still in the air, still whispered through the trees. In every gust that rattled the leaves, in every draft that slipped beneath my jacket, I heard it. Faint, patient, endless. Daniel. And I know the next time I camp in the mountains, no matter where, no matter when, 12:17 a.m. will find me again. I walked out of the Rockies with the weight of fire still in my lungs, the black smoke etched into my memory, and the echo of a voice that will never leave me. People always say the mountains teach you lessons if you listen, about humility, about endurance, about respect for the wild. But the lesson I carried was darker. Once the wilderness learns your name, it never gives it back. Every gust of wind since that night has felt different. In town, by highways, even through open windows, I catch it. My name, stretched thin, folded into the breath of the air. It doesn't matter how far I drive. It doesn't matter that I burned the camper to ash. The Rockies marked me, and there's no undoing that kind of bond. I used to think fear was something you overcame, that you pushed through it, climbed higher, camped deeper until you earned the right to stand above it. But real fear, the kind born in the marrow of the night when the world itself speaks your name, that kind of fear doesn't fade. It follows. It shapes you. It waits at the edges of silence. So if you ever find yourself high in those ridges at midnight, when the world is so still you can hear the blood in your ears and the wind suddenly changes, don't listen too closely. Don't answer back. And if you hear crying carried through the trees at 12:17 a.m., remember my mistake. Some voices aren't meant to be found because the mountains don't want your sympathy. They want your name. And once they have it, they'll whisper it back to you. I remember the silence first, the kind of silence that doesn't invite you in, it warns you. The Great Smoky Mountains are rarely quiet. They're alive with insects, the rustle of deer, the occasional crunch of boots on gravel trails. But on that September afternoon, at exactly 3:09 p.m., the woods swallowed every sound as though it was holding its breath. My name is David. I'm 34 years old, and I thought I knew these mountains better than most. I grew up a few hours east in North Carolina, and ever since I was a kid, the Smokies had both my playground and my teacher. Every hike had taught me something, how to respect the weather, how to stay on marked trails, how to carry what you need and leave behind what you don't. But no one had ever prepared me for what I was about to uncover that day. The plan was simple. Hike out alone, camp one night in a remote site off the Alum Cave Trail, and make my way back before sunset the following day. I had hiked solo before. It wasn't a reckless choice, but a deliberate one. Solitude in the mountains strips away everything unnecessary. You start hearing your own heartbeat echo against the cliffs, your breath mingling with the mist that clings to the trees. But as I should have remembered, solitude also makes you vulnerable. And the woods, for all their beauty, don't care if you're ready or not. The climb had been steady all morning, the kind that forces your muscles to remember their limits. The canopy shifted as I ascended, trees thinning out just enough to let in fractured beams of sunlight. I stopped at a clearing to drink from my water bottle, and that's when I noticed something odd. Bare earth, freshly disturbed, just off the trail. It wasn't large, maybe the size of a small camping cot, but it stood out like a scar against the forest floor. The soil in the Smokies tends to be hard-packed and tangled with roots, not something you'd expect to see churned up unless something or someone had been there recently. I don't know why I walked toward it. Maybe curiosity, maybe instinct, maybe that quiet that had been trailing me since noon. I crouched down, running my fingers lightly over the uneven surface. That's when I saw it, a crude cross made of two branches tied together with twine, half buried in the dirt. It wasn't a park marker, not the kind rangers use for boundaries or research. No, this was personal. Human. I wish I could tell you I turned back right then, that I reported it and left it for someone else to handle. But the truth is, something in me wanted to know. Not because I was brave, because I was afraid. The cross, the soil, the silence pressing down on me, all of it whispered the same thing. Someone didn't want this found. I cleared some of the leaves with the heel of my boot, brushing aside the twigs that had been scattered to disguise the mound. My stomach tightened, my breath shallow. There's a weight that comes with realizing you're not just looking at dirt anymore. You're standing over a grave. My rational mind tried to argue it could have been an animal burial or maybe some kind of backcountry tradition I didn't understand. But the depth, the shape, the cross, they betrayed something far heavier. The strangest part was the time. I looked at my watch without meaning to, and the numbers blinked back at me, 3:09 p.m. I don't know why it lodged itself so deeply in my mind, but that moment, frozen in silence, staring down at a grave that wasn't supposed to be there, felt like the mountain itself had stamped it into my memory. I stood up quickly, too quickly, and the blood rushed from my head. For a second, the woods spun, branches tilting against the pale blue sky, and I had to steady myself against a tree. When my vision cleared, I felt eyes on me. It wasn't paranoia. I've spent too much time in the wilderness to confuse nerves with presence. Someone, or something, was nearby. Watching. I tried to shake it off, told myself I was imagining it. But when you're alone out there, you can't dismiss instinct. Instinct keeps you alive. I backed away from the disturbed ground, careful not to leave obvious tracks, and returned to the trail. My legs carried me faster than I intended, crunching twigs underfoot, breath ragged in my chest. Every time I looked over my shoulder, the woods seemed to fold in tighter, shadows lengthening even though it was still bright afternoon. I should have turned back to the trailhead then. I should have let fear dictate my next steps. But stubbornness is a dangerous trait in the wilderness, and mine whispered that if I left so quickly, I'd never forgive myself. I had planned to camp to stay the night, and I convinced myself that the grave was none of my business. That's what fear does. It bargains with you. It tells you that ignorance is safer than truth. By the time I reached my chosen campsite, a small flat patch near the river, the air had grown heavy. Clouds gathered low, bruised purple and gray, promising a storm. I set up my tent quickly, hands shaking more than I wanted to admit. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that the soil had been disturbed recently, that whatever was buried beneath that cross wasn't old. And that meant someone had been here not long before me. The rain started just as the tent stakes bit into the ground, sharp droplets tapping against nylon like impatient fingers. I crawled inside, lit my small lantern, and tried to breathe through the unease. But the forest didn't settle with the storm. Instead, the rain only deepened the silence. No frogs, no crickets, not even the usual patter of squirrels darting between trees. Just water and my own heart pounding against the thin fabric walls. And then I heard it. A footstep. Not the cracking randomness of a branch falling, not the shifting groan of a tree under wind. A deliberate step, soft, measured, pacing along the trail just beyond where I had pitched my tent. I froze, every nerve screaming at once. Whoever it was didn't hurry. The steps came slow, steady, as though the person outside wanted me to know they were there. Rain muffled the sound, but it couldn't disguise intent. I clutched the handle of my knife, more comfort than defense, and waited, barely daring to breathe. The steps circled, pausing occasionally, then moving again. Once, they stopped directly behind my tent, no more than a yard away. The air was electric, heavy with the kind of tension that makes the hair rise on your arms. And then, after what felt like an hour but could only have been a minute, the sound drifted back toward the trail, fading, disappearing into the downpour. I sat there in the glow of my lantern, drenched in fear, and knew one thing with certainty. I had stumbled onto something I was never meant to see. I didn't sleep. Not really. I lay there in my tent, the storm raging overhead, listening to the water course down the slopes like veins opening in the earth. Every shift of fabric, every groan of a branch in the wind felt like someone pressing their face close to the nylon wall, listening in on my breath. My lantern had gone dim, its small flame flickering until it finally choked itself out, and I was left in a darkness that felt thicker than night should allow. I tried counting my breaths, tried to let exhaustion pull me under, but each time my eyelids grew heavy, the memory of those footsteps jarred me awake. Whoever it had been, they hadn't come with purpose to harm me. Not yet. They had circled, watched, waited, and that was worse. At some point, the rain slowed, breaking into scattered drips and muffled streams. I dared to unzip the corner of my tent just enough to peek outside. The forest glistened silver in the after-rain, the mist curling low against the ground like smoke. For a moment, I thought I saw movement between the trees. A shape, human-like, standing still where the trail curved back into shadow. I blinked hard, wiped my eyes, and it was gone. My mind whispered it was exhaustion, but my gut screamed otherwise. You don't spend decades in the backcountry without learning the difference between imagination and presence. Something had been there. The ground was soft from the downpour, and my instincts told me to check for tracks at first light. Until then, I sat with my knife resting in my lap, ears tuned to every sound, reminding myself that fear is not proof, but it is a warning. The hours bled together until gray dawn finally pried open the sky, painting the woods with a light so thin it felt borrowed. I forced myself out of the tent, body stiff and mind raw from the sleepless night. The first thing I noticed was the silence again. No morning chorus of birds, no chatter of squirrels, just the faint rush of the river downstream. The second thing was the mud. My campsite should have been a mess of puddles and soft earth from the rain, but on the slope leading from the trail to my tent, the ground was cleanly pressed. Tracks. Human. A single set, deliberate, circling exactly where I had heard the footsteps the night before. The prints weren't heavy enough to suggest someone carrying gear, which meant they hadn't been another camper. No pack, no walking stick. Just feet, moving with patience. I crouched over them, tracing their outline with my eyes, and felt a shiver run down my spine. Whoever had been there knew how to move quietly, how to step without sinking too deep into the soil. Not an amateur, not a hiker. I broke camp faster than I ever had before. My hands shook as I stuffed my tent into its sack, my mind racing with questions I didn't want answered. Who had buried what I found? Why did they return? Why circle my tent instead of confronting me? The longer I stayed, the clearer the message became. You don't belong here. I strapped my pack tight, slid the knife into the side pocket where I could reach it easily, and started back toward the main trail. The woods were washed clean from the storm, branches dripping, the ground slick. I told myself I'd keep moving, that I'd put as much distance between myself and that unmarked grave as possible. But the mountains have a way of testing your resolve. The deeper I walked, the stronger the pull became to glance back, to feel for the presence behind me. And sure enough, I began to hear it again. Not close. Not close. Not right at my back. But there, a faint rhythm. Footfalls echoing mine with just enough delay to keep me doubting. If I stopped, the sound stopped. If I pushed harder, it followed. Whoever or whatever had circled me last night wasn't finished. I veered off the trail once, crouching low in a thicket of rhododendrons, holding my breath as the sound drew closer. I waited for a shape to pass, a face, anything to prove my fear had a body. But the path stayed empty. When I finally stood, damp leaves clinging to my jacket, the air was colder, sharper. That was when I noticed something worse than footsteps. The smell. It carried faintly through the mist, metallic and sour, like rust and decay braided together. I had smelled it before on hunts, the stench of an animal gone to rot, but here, deep on a hiking trail where no carcass should have lingered, it carried a human weight. My stomach clenched, and my mind rushed back to that mound of disturbed earth. The thought struck me suddenly, unshakably. The grave wasn't old. It wasn't even finished. I should have turned and bolted, but the Smokies have a way of forcing you to face what you fear. I pressed on, each step heavier than the last, until the trail opened slightly and I recognized where I was. The same curve where I'd thought I saw someone standing the night before. And there, just off the path, the soil was churned again. This time, though, it wasn't covered. A shallow pit gaped between the roots, water pooled at the bottom from last night's rain. The crude wooden cross lay, knocked aside, as though someone had returned in the night to dig again. I wanted to believe it was an animal, some bear rooting for carrion. But the pit was too clean, the edges too precise. My pulse thundered in my ears as I crouched closer, against my better judgment, and then I saw it. Fabric. Torn, muddied, clinging to something pale beneath the surface. Not bone, not yet exposed, but flesh, water-swollen, gray against the dark earth. My throat went dry. The world tilted. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a root, and gripped a tree to steady myself. There was no denying it now. Someone had buried a body here, and someone had come back to finish what they started. And I had camped less than a mile away. The forest pressed in on me, every trunk a shadow, every rustle of leaves a threat. I couldn't breathe right, couldn't think past the pounding in my head. I needed to get out, needed to get off this trail before whoever had buried that body realized I was still here. But as I turned, preparing to push myself harder than I ever had before, I heard it again. That same deliberate step. Closer this time. And for the first time since I was a child lost in these very woods, I felt the raw, suffocating certainty that I wasn't going to make it back. I froze against the tree, every muscle locking tight as if stillness alone could render me invisible. The sound came again, deliberate, one step and then another, moving through the dripping undergrowth just beyond my sight line. My lungs burned from holding back breath, but the forest around me felt sharper than oxygen, like the air itself was bristling against my skin. I didn't dare call out. Whoever it was hadn't made a mistake circling me last night, hadn't stumbled by chance onto this trail. They were purposeful, intentional. The figure appeared between the trees. At first just a blur, dark fabric moving where there should have been only bark and shadow. My pulse spiked, hammering in my ears as my eyes adjusted to the mist. A man. Tall, thin, his shoulders sloped under a heavy coat. His face was obscured by the angle, but his gait was unmistakable, steady, unhurried, the same rhythm that had stalked my tent. He didn't look at me at first. He walked straight to the half-open grave, crouched low beside it, and rested his hand against the edge of the pit. I felt bile rise in my throat as I realized he wasn't shocked by what was uncovered. He was inspecting it, like someone checking their work. I shifted slightly, trying to melt deeper into the bark at my back, but the movement was enough. His head turned. Slowly. Deliberately. Our eyes locked through the mist. I wish I could tell you what I saw on his face, but it wasn't anger and it wasn't fear. It was worse. It was recognition. As if he already knew me, had expected me to be standing there. He rose with a calmness that defied the gravity of what lay at his feet. And for a moment, an agonizing, stretched-out eternity, he just watched me, head tilted slightly, water dripping from the brim of his coat. Then, without a word, he bent down, lifted the crude wooden cross, and laid it carefully back across the open pit. That simple act, that quiet, methodical gesture, snapped me into motion. I turned and bolted down the trail, my boots slipping against wet earth, lungs searing as I forced air in ragged bursts. Branches clawed at my arms, stones shifted underfoot, but adrenaline drowned out the pain. All I could think was, don't stop, don't look back, don't give him the chance to close the distance. But the woods were merciless. Every bend in the trail looked the same, every fallen log a mirror of the last. The Smokies can disorient even seasoned hikers, and fear twists your bearings until nothing feels familiar. My breath came hot, my vision tunneling, and still I ran. I could hear him behind me now, no rush in his stride, but always there. Footsteps like a metronome, steady, certain, patient. I don't know how long I kept it up. Minutes? Hours? Time dissolves when panic takes the reins. Eventually, my legs gave a warning tremor, and I knew if I didn't slow, I'd collapse. I forced myself off the main path, crashing through underbrush until I found a hollow beneath a cluster of hemlocks. I dropped flat, chest heaving, sweat and rain mixing across my skin. Silence. I pressed my face into the damp soil, listening with every ounce of will I had left. And then it came again, a single step, closer. And then, nothing. I lay there until my body went numb, until the cold earth seeped into my bones and the fog thickened into a curtain I couldn't see through. Every instinct screamed to run again, to push until I hit the trailhead, until I saw another human face, until I knew I was out. But exhaustion pinned me down, and a darker realization settled in. If he wanted to catch me, he could have. He wasn't chasing. He was shepherding. When I finally rose, my knees buckled beneath me. I staggered through the trees, compass shaking in my hands as I fought to reorient. The sky had shifted, clouds breaking just enough to let shafts of light scatter across the canopy. And in that moment of weak clarity, I realized I wasn't far from the Alum Cave bluffs. Civilization, trailheads, rangers, safety was still miles away, but the bluffs marked a landmark I knew. If I could reach them, I could anchor myself back to the familiar. I pushed forward, every sound behind me amplified, every rustle of leaves a ghost at my back. The grave, the man, the silence, they merged into one truth. I had trespassed into something that didn't want to be unearthed. My survival depended on carrying that weight out of the mountains without faltering. When I finally broke through the trees and saw the bluffs rising above me, carved like ancient teeth into the slope, my chest cracked open with relief. The air thinned, crisp against my lungs, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I had outrun it, that the mountains would let me go. But then I looked down. Carved into the wet earth at the base of the bluff was a mark, not a footprint this time, not an accident of mud or water, a cross. 2 lines etched deep, freshly pressed into the soil, and beside it, the time, 3:09. Scratched with precision into the dirt, waiting for me like a signature. My body went cold, my vision blurred. That wasn't a coincidence, not an accident of numbers burned into my brain yesterday. It was deliberate, a message. He hadn't just seen me, he had been expecting me. The woods closed in again, silent, unyielding, and I knew then that I was part of something I couldn't comprehend, something buried as deep in these mountains as the unmarked grave itself. The mark in the soil held me captive. My eyes locked on it, my body refusing to move, as if those lines carried more weight than the mountain itself. 3:9. The same number etched into my memory the moment I'd uncovered that grave. The same hour the woods had swallowed every sound. I had thought time was just a marker, a coincidence burned into me by fear. But now, carved, deliberate, and waiting, I understood. It was a ritual, a pattern. I hadn't stumbled into a random grave. I had stepped into something rehearsed, repeated, and alive in these woods long before I arrived. I wanted to scream to break the silence with some human sound that might tether me back to reality. But my throat locked tight, as if even the air warned me not to provoke the thing that lingered out there, unseen. Instead, I staggered back from the bluff wall, my pack dragging heavy against my shoulders, my legs trembling as if they no longer belonged to me. Two choices sat in front of me, and neither offered comfort. I could turn back, retrace my steps, risk running straight into him again, or I could press deeper, taking the longer, harsher loop toward the ridgeline, praying it spat me out closer to safety. Either way, the woods had me. Either way, I was moving through someone else's design. I chose the ridgeline. Not because it was safer, because it gave me the illusion of choice. Fear demands movement. Stillness would have broken me, and maybe that's what he wanted. The climb was brutal. My thighs burned, lungs ragged, each step dragging me further from the comfort of known trails. The mist thickened as the elevation rose, clinging like smoke so that even the trees seemed blurred and shifting. I leaned into the rhythm, step, breath, heartbeat, repeating it like a prayer, as though the cadence itself could keep me alive. But the woods didn't leave me alone. Every so often, a flicker of movement teased the corner of my vision, a darker patch of shadow breaking between the pines, a branch swaying against the still air. Once, I caught the clear outline of a shoulder, a head, a figure pacing me along the slope, always just far enough to blur into fog when I turned. And then came the smell again. Metallic, rotting, sweet in the most repulsive way. It seeped from the earth, from the mist, until breathing felt like swallowing decay. I pulled my shirt over my mouth, forcing the air through fabric, but it clung to me, thick and inescapable. It was him, I thought. Not the man, what he carried, what he buried. That grave was not alone. At one bend in the trail, my boot slipped in the mud, and I went down hard, my palms grinding against sharp stone. I hissed through clenched teeth, blood already welling from the cuts. And that's when I heard it, not footsteps this time, a voice, low, muffled. Somewhere ahead, curling back through the mist like smoke carried on the wind. I couldn't make out the words, not in any language I knew, but it wasn't a hiker calling out, not a ranger giving warning. It was a murmur, rhythmic, deliberate, like a chant. My body locked. I pressed against the ground, every instinct screaming not to move. The voice grew louder, steady and unbroken, echoing through the trees as if the forest itself spoke in tongues. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. And in the silence that followed, I realized I wasn't alone on this ridgeline. I pushed forward. Faster now, every wound and ache drowned out by the need to get away. The path thinned, narrowing against the slope until I came to a break in the trees. The world opened, and I saw the mountains roll out before me, endless ridges layered against the horizon, each swallowed in fog. For a moment, I thought I could breathe again, that the chant, the footsteps, the grave, they belonged to the shadowed valley below, and up here I was free. But then I saw it. Another mound, smaller than the first, perched right at the ridgeline as if marking territory, soil freshly overturned, roots hacked apart to make room, and on top of it another crude cross, the twine still wet, as though it had been placed not hours but minutes ago. My chest seized. This wasn't random. The graves weren't hidden in some forgotten corner of the woods. They were mapped, placed, aligned with the trails, the landmarks, the places hikers like me were bound to pass. I staggered back, eyes darting around the ridge, and that's when I saw him again. Not 20 yards away, standing among the fog-shrouded trees. His face clearer now, sharp in its angles, eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. He didn't move, didn't chase, just stood there, watching, one hand resting on the handle of a spade that gleamed wet in the weak light. It hit me then. He wasn't a ghost. Not some mountain legend whispered by locals. He was flesh and blood. And that was worse, because flesh and blood can follow you home. I stumbled backward, the ridge yawning behind me, the world spinning between survival and collapse. His lips moved once, slow and deliberate, but the words were swallowed by the wind. And then, just like before, he tilted his head slightly, as if acknowledging me, as if confirming I was now part of something I couldn't escape. I turned and ran again, not down the ridge, not towards safety, just away. The mountains swallowed me whole, the fog tightening, the graves aligning in patterns I no longer understood, and all I carried with me was the certainty that 309 wasn't just a time, it was a sentence. A mark laid on me the moment I looked into that grave. The forest changed as I ran. I'd spent years in the Smokies, long enough to know the shift between ridges, hollows, coves, but this was different. The trees closed in with a density that made the air feel thick, almost unbreathable. Hemlocks towered like pillars, their branches tangling so tightly they strangled the daylight. The ground softened into a carpet of moss and black soil that swallowed the sound of my steps, so that even in my frantic retreat, the woods forced me into silence. It felt wrong, like stepping into a place not meant for people. My compass spun erratically in my hand, the needle quivering as if magnetized by something buried deep beneath the earth. I knew the Smokies could be disorienting, that the mist could trick your bearings, but this wasn't confusion. This was direction, forced upon me. Every time I veered off, every time I tried to climb toward light or slope toward water, the terrain folded back, funneling me deeper into the shadowed core of the mountain. My legs ached, lungs raw from gulping damp air, but the terror of stopping was greater than the pain of continuing. Until the woods themselves decided for me. I stumbled into a clearing so suddenly it felt like being shoved through a doorway. The trees gave way to a wide, sunken hollow, its floor slick with mud and roots exposed like veins across the earth. And scattered there, too many to count at first, were the mounds. Graves, some fresh, soil-damp and dark, others older, sunken and clothed in moss, each one marked by the same crude cross, twine binding branches like a signature. They spread in circles, widening out from the center of the hollow like ripples on water. I fell to my knees, my body unwilling to carry me further. My mind buckled against the sight. This wasn't one grave hidden by chance. This was a cemetery, unmarked, unmapped, unacknowledged. Dozens of lives smothered beneath the soil of a mountain that swallowed their stories whole. The air was suffocating here. The same stench of rot clung to my throat, heavier now, undeniable. I covered my mouth, my eyes watering, but it wasn't just decay. It was chemical, sharp, like earth mixed with something metallic, preserved. Whoever buried these bodies hadn't just hidden them, they had prepared them. And then I heard him, the voice again, louder now. Not muffled by distance or softened by fog. The chant rose from somewhere within the hollow, echoing off the slopes so I couldn't pinpoint its origin. The syllables rolled low, guttural, threaded with rhythm that made my chest tighten with dread. It wasn't English, wasn't anything I recognized. It was older, primal, the kind of sound that doesn't need translation to strike bone-deep fear. I scrambled backward, my palms sinking into wet earth, my boots slipping against the graves themselves. I whispered apologies under my breath as if the ground beneath me could hear, and maybe it could, because the chant grew louder. From the edge of the clearing, he stepped into view. Not rushed, not triumphant, just steady. The same tall, thin figure, coat clinging wet against his frame, spade glinting in one hand. His face was clearer in the half-light now, cheekbones sharp, eyes sunk deep, but what rooted me in place was the stillness in his expression. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even surprised. He looked at me like a craftsman would regard a tool, useful, expected, replaceable. The chant didn't come from him, not exactly. His lips moved, yes, but the sound seemed to rise from the ground itself, vibrating through the mounds until my teeth ached with it. I tried to stand, but my legs refused. My knife was still strapped to my pack, unreachable in my panic. All I had were my words, fragile as breath. Why? My voice cracked against the hollow. Why here? He stopped a few paces from me, tilting his head the way he had before, like studying a specimen. And then, for the first time, he spoke. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, but the weight of it pressed down harder than any storm. This place remembers. That was all. No explanation, no threat, just that. And then he stepped closer, raising the spade as if to mark another mound. The chant swelled, the earth beneath me trembling faintly, and I realized with a clarity that burned through my terror, these graves weren't random. They were chosen, and the empty ground at my knees was waiting for me. Something in me snapped. Survival surged hotter than fear, and I lunged, not toward him but sideways, clawing through mud, scrambling up the slope of the hollow. My nails tore against roots, my knees shredded by stone, but I climbed with a desperation born only from the certainty of death below. Behind me, the chant didn't falter. It rose, steady as a drumbeat, carrying through the trees even as I pulled myself out of the clearing and back into the suffocating forest. The graves receded, the hollow swallowed by mist, but the sound followed, riding the air until it was no longer a voice but the pulse of the mountain itself. I didn't stop, not when my body begged. Not when night threatened again, not even when blood ran sticky down my shins, because somewhere behind me a man with a spade was waiting, and somewhere beneath me the earth had already made room. And I knew 3-9 would come again. The woods at night are not the same woods you walk through by day. Shadows stretch longer, sounds sharpen, and the mind fills the gaps with things you don't want to name. I pushed through that darkness like a man half blind, my flashlight beam weak and shivering in the mist. Every step tore at me, my knees raw, my palms sticky with blood and dirt, but stopping meant letting that hollow catch me again. And I couldn't, not with those graves still breathing behind me. The forest had grown strange, unrecognizable. Trails I should have known bent at angles that didn't belong. Ridges rose where no ridges should have been. Streams appeared and vanished without leading anywhere. My compass needle still spun uselessly, tugged in every direction like a magnet fighting unseen poles. I had studied maps of these mountains my whole life, memorized their cuts and folds, but now I might as well have been walking through a dream. A dream, or a trap. Hours passed, or minutes, I couldn't tell. My watch had stopped, its hands frozen exactly at the same cursed time. 3:09. I tapped the glass until my knuckles ached, but the second hand refused to move. It was as if the mountain itself was telling me time no longer belonged to me. Out here, I walked by a different clock. Exhaustion chewed at me. Every muscle burned, my vision swam, and the night pressed in heavy, whispering that if I lay down just for a moment, the woods might cradle me. But I had seen too many mounds to believe that rest here was anything but surrender. My thoughts blurred, memories bleeding into hallucinations. I saw faces in the bark of trees, pale hands reaching from the underbrush, eyes gleaming like coals where no animal stood. Somewhere in that delirium, I began to hear them again. Not just one voice now, the chant layered, multiplied, woven into the mist until it surrounded me. Some tones low and guttural, others high and sharp, the whole chorus vibrating in my chest until I thought my ribs might crack. The language still meant nothing to my ears, but my bones understood. It was calling something, summoning, or maybe simply marking another hour. And then the woods shifted again. I stumbled into another clearing, smaller than the hollow but more deliberate. Stones arranged in a circle, each one smeared with something dark that gleamed in the beam of my light. In the center, a pit had been dug, fresh, its edges sharp, its depth yawning open like a wound, the soil piled neatly beside it, prepared, waiting. I staggered back, bile rising in my throat. My legs wanted to give, but the terror kept them locked. This wasn't just a graveyard now. This was my grave. The ground didn't just happen to be ready. It had been readied. My flashlight sputtered, once, twice, then dimmed to a sickly glow. In that stuttering light, I caught movement beyond the stones. A figure, tall and thin, slipping between the trees, then another, and another. Shapes blending with shadow, too many to count, each one standing silent at the edge of the circle, watching. The chanting grew louder, though none of their mouths moved. It poured from the earth, from the stones, from the pit itself, until my skull rattled with it. My light flickered again, and in that brief darkness, I felt the press of presence closer than breath. When it flared back, the figures hadn't moved, but I had no doubt they could. I ran. Not because I thought I could outrun them, because not running meant stepping willingly into the circle. My body tore through brush, snagged on branches, crashed against roots. But I kept going, lungs ripping, throat raw from gulping cold air. The chant followed, unbroken, until I could no longer tell if it was behind me or inside me. At some point, my flashlight died entirely, and I was swallowed by blackness. I stumbled blind, hands outstretched, crashing through whatever the mountain put in my way. My legs buckled more than once, but adrenaline wrenched me back upright. I don't know how far I traveled or in what direction. I only knew I couldn't stop, not until something, anything, shifted. And then at last it did. The trees thinned. The ground leveled. A new sound bled through the silence, the low, steady rush of water. My chest cracked open with hope so fierce it hurt. A river meant a landmark. A landmark meant orientation. Orientation meant maybe, just maybe, escape. I stumbled toward the sound until the trees fell away and I stood at the edge of a wide, roaring river, its current swollen from the storm. The moon broke weakly through the mist, silvering the waves. For the first time in hours, I saw open space, but relief died quick. Because on the opposite bank, lined along the tree line like sentinels, stood the figures. Dozens of them. Silent, unmoving, their dark forms etched against the pale fog, and at their center, holding the spade like a staff, was him. Even across the roar of water, I knew his eyes were locked on me. He didn't move. None of them did. But I felt the truth in my marrow. The river wasn't a boundary. It was a marker. I hadn't escaped. I had been herded here. And as the moonlight touched the water, I saw it. Shapes caught in the current. Not branches, not debris. Faces, pale, swollen, drifting past like offerings carried downstream. My knees buckled and I dropped to the mud, the roar of the river blending with the chant that still hummed inside my bones. I had fled all night, but the Smokies had led me exactly where they wanted me. And in that moment, with the watchers across the bank and the dead drifting at my feet, I understood the lesson carved into every grave, every cross, every mark. There is no leaving untouched. The night broke slowly, as if the mountain itself was reluctant to release me. A thin gray seeped into the sky, dull and heavy, smudging out the stars. The river kept its voice, a low roar that sounded less like water and more like the steady breathing of something vast, ancient, and patient. My body trembled where I knelt, mud soaking into my jeans, the chill gnawing deep enough that it felt like it had entered my bones. Across the water, the line of figures remained, silent as stone. They did not shift. They did not leave. They simply watched, their presence more suffocating than if they had spoken. The spade glinted faintly in the first smear of light, the man at the center holding it upright as if it were a flag planted in conquered ground. Even from that distance, I knew he was smiling, or worse, that he didn't need to smile. His stillness said enough. He had time. They all had time. The mountain was theirs. I was the intruder, and they weren't in a hurry to remove me. The thought of staying there, pinned between the river and their eyes, clawed at my mind. My body ached with exhaustion. My throat scorched from breathing too hard, and my legs begged me to collapse fully to just let the mud take me. But another voice, deeper, more primal, cut through the fog. If I stopped moving, I was finished. I staggered up, legs screaming, and turned to the river. The current churned, swollen from the rain, carrying pale shapes in its rush. Some were broken tree limbs, some were not. The water was merciless, a wall of cold force ready to tear apart anything soft enough to fall inside. Crossing it meant gambling with my life. Staying meant gambling with something worse. I pressed my hands into my face, smearing grit and blood across my skin, and forced myself to breathe. In. Out. One more. I thought of all the hikers who had gone missing in these mountains, their names carved into wooden signs, their faces faded on flyers stapled to ranger station boards. Had they stood here too? Had they looked at this same river and realized they had no good choice? Maybe the graves weren't just about death. Maybe they were about decisions that broke a person before the mountain buried the rest. My boots sank into the mud at the water's edge. The cold spray kissed my ankles, and the sheer power of it made my heart hammer so hard I thought it might burst. I tested the ground with my other foot, searching for a rock, a hold, anything to anchor me. But there was no gentleness to the river. It demanded everything at once. Behind me, the forest exhaled, branches shifting though no wind moved. My head snapped back, and in that moment I saw movement among the trees on my side of the bank. Not far. Closer than before. The watchers weren't just across the river anymore. They were here. A sound broke loose from my throat, half growl, half sob. There was no more choice. Either I faced the river or I faced them. I stepped in. The shock of the cold was violent, a knife through muscle and bone. My breath exploded out of me as the water slammed against my thighs, dragging at me like hands desperate to pull me down. I forced my weight forward, planting each step on slick rocks that shifted underfoot. The roar filled my ears until I couldn't even hear my own gasps. Every inch was a battle, legs straining, arms clawing at invisible holds, the current twisting me sideways. Halfway across, I slipped. My knees smashed against stone, my hands scraped raw as I flailed for balance. For one sickening moment, the water surged over my chest, trying to swallow me whole. Faces flashed beneath the surface, pale and bloated, their mouths open as if singing that endless chant. My scream bubbled into silence, swallowed by the current. Somehow, through instinct or sheer desperation, I found a foothold. My boot lodged between two stones, my body heaved forward, and I clawed against the drag until my chest broke the surface again. I coughed, choked, spit, and pushed. One step, another. Every inch closer to the opposite bank felt like a betrayal of the river itself, as if it were punishing me for refusing to belong to its collection. And then stone turned to mud. My hands clutched grass, wet earth giving under my grip. With one final surge, I dragged myself out, collapsing face first on the opposite shore, coughing up river water until my ribs hurt. My body shook uncontrollably, soaked to the marrow, but I had crossed. I had crossed. I dared to look up, gasping. The far bank was empty. The line of watchers was gone. The man with the spade no longer stood in the mist. Only the dark trees swayed in silence, as if nothing had ever been there at all. But the chant still thrummed inside me. The gray dawn spread wider now, peeling the mist back in strands, revealing the long slope of the ridge ahead. Somewhere beyond it, I told myself, there had to be a road, a campsite, a sign of life untouched by graves and chants and rivers of the dead. I staggered to my feet, my body screaming protest, and set one foot in front of the other. The Smokies did not let me go easily. Every step was a test, every sound another whisper urging me back, every shadow a reminder that the mountain doesn't forget. But as the light grew stronger, I clung to one truth. I was still moving, still breathing, still refusing to stop, and maybe, just maybe, that refusal was the only thing that had carried me through the night. The ridge ahead felt endless. Each step pulled at muscles already torn and burning, each breath like dragging air through cracked glass. But the light kept rising, thin beams of sun filtering through breaks in the trees, and for the first time since the hollow, I could see color again. Greens of moss, the muted browns of oak bark, the pale streaks of birch. After hours of drowning in shadows, the return of daylight should have brought relief. Instead, it only unsettled me more. Because daylight didn't erase what had happened. It simply revealed that the forest itself hadn't changed. The trail beneath my boots looked like any other trail I'd hiked before. Muddy, rooted, unremarkable. The ridge sloped like any ridge in these mountains, familiar and ordinary. And yet I knew, with every shiver that still lived under my skin, that this wasn't the same forest I had entered. Or maybe it was, but I wasn't the same man walking out of it. Hours dragged on, the rhythm of my footsteps broken by stumbles, pauses, the occasional collapse onto my knees when my strength gave out. At one point I fell so hard against a tree that I thought I might not get up. The bark pressed into my cheek, rough and solid, and I whispered to it like it could answer me. Just let me out. Please, let me out. My voice cracked in the silence, and the woods gave no reply. But the mountain had its own way of answering. Around noon, I reached a fork in the path, a place I should have recognized. The markers were there, faint carvings in the wood of a signpost, the kind rangers use to orient hikers. But the names etched into the wood didn't make sense. They weren't trail names. They weren't English at all. They were the same sharp, curling symbols I had seen carved into the bark around the graves. Fresh, deep, as if the wood itself had grown into the language overnight. I staggered back from it, bile rising in my throat. My compass needle spun again, no direction steady, no truth to cling to. I could only choose, blind and desperate, and trust my feet. So I picked left, because left felt like less resistance, and I kept walking. The chant followed me in the silence, not out loud now, but from within. Like the rhythm of my pulse, it threaded itself into the beat of my heart. I hummed without realizing, the same way you hum when a tune won't leave you. And when I caught myself, panic surged so violently I bit my tongue to stop. The taste of blood grounded me, but only for a while. And then I saw it, through the trees, a clearing. Not the hollow, not another pit, but something human. Metal glinting in the sunlight. My chest broke open with something wild and raw, hope so sharp it hurt. I forced my body forward, crashing through the brush until I stumbled onto a gravel road. A road. The sight of it nearly brought me to my knees. The gravel was rutted, worn by tires. To my left, the slope dropped into forest. To my right, the curve bent out of sight. I turned right, limping, dragging, half running on sheer will. Minutes later, the forest pulled back enough to reveal it. A trailhead parking lot. 2 cars sat there, dusted with pollen, their paint faded from years of sun. And beside them, blessed, ordinary, real, stood a bulletin board. The kind nailed together with rough timber, plastered with maps, warnings, and faded, missing hiker notices curled at the edges. I collapsed in front of it, pressing my forehead against the wood. Tears broke before I could stop them. Civilization. Proof that the world outside still existed. But then, through the blur of tears, I saw something new tacked to the board. A fresh sheet of paper, edges still clean, the ink dark. I reached for it with a trembling hand. It wasn't a missing poster. It was a list of names, and halfway down the page, there was mine. The letters were sharp, unmistakable, printed in the same hand that had carved symbols into bark and stone. My name, my age, my description. A note beside it, last seen 3:09 p.m., Great Smoky Mountains. My stomach hollowed out, air leaving me in a rush. I staggered back, the edges of the world tilting. Behind me, the forest waited, quiet, watchful. I could feel their eyes again. Not across the river now, not beyond a pit, but here in the daylight, hidden in the green. And I understood then, the mountain hadn't let me go. It had marked me, written me into its story the way it had written the others. The road, the cars, the board, they weren't escape. They were a reminder. A warning nailed into timber for whoever came next. The graves had never been about the past. They were about the future. And now I was part of them. I sank onto the gravel, the sun warm on my face, tears drying in streaks. People would come here later, families, hikers, campers. They'd park their cars, lace their boots, glance at the board without reading too close. They'd walk into the trees, smiling, alive. And maybe they'd never see what I had seen. Maybe they'd come back with nothing but stories of fog and waterfalls. But some wouldn't. And when their names appeared on that board beside mine, someone else would stumble through the night, claw their way to the river, and crawl out onto the other side, convinced they had survived, only to find their name already waiting. The mountain doesn't forget. It doesn't forgive. And neither will I. I sat there on the gravel until the sun rose higher, until its light painted the ridges gold and filled the parking lot with a warmth that didn't reach me. Cars pulled in eventually. A couple stepped out, stretching, laughing, the way hikers do before a day on the trail. They nodded at me politely, as if I were nothing more than another tired traveler. I opened my mouth to speak, to warn them, but no words came. The chant lay too heavy in my throat. My silence felt chosen for me. They walked past, eyes skimming the board. Their smiles didn't falter. They didn't notice the new page. Or if they did, maybe it read different to them. Maybe to their eyes it was just another warning, another faded flyer. I wanted to scream, to grab their shoulders, to shake them until they understood, but my arms stayed limp at my sides. And as they disappeared into the trees, laughter trailing after them, I realized the cruelest truth. The mountain doesn't need to be believed to do its work. I forced myself up, legs trembling, and leaned against the board one last time. My fingers brushed over my name, tracing the letters as if by touching them I might erase them. But they didn't smear, didn't blur. They were carved into the story now, just as sure as the crosses in the soil, just as sure as the faces in the river. I thought about leaving, about walking down the road until I found pavement, houses, the hum of human life. But a weight pressed in my chest, heavy and certain, I'd never really leave. Even if I walked miles away, even if I crossed states, even if I never set foot in these woods again, the mountain had me. It had written me into itself, and a part of me would always be called back, no matter how far I ran. The graves had shown me that. They weren't just holes in the ground. They were promises, promises that the mountain keeps everything it touches. I looked once more at the trail, at the shadowed mouth of trees where the couple had vanished. My heart ached with a useless kind of love for them, for anyone who walked in blind, unaware of what the Smokies held close. I wanted to believe they'd come back. I wanted to believe laughter was stronger than whatever waited beyond 309. But I knew better. The mountain had taught me. It taught me that fear doesn't end at daylight, that silence is louder than screams. That sometimes survival isn't about escape, but about carrying the story forward so others know what waits if they dare too deep. And so here I stand telling it. My name already written, my fate already bound, but my voice still mine for now. If you hear this, if you take anything from it, let it be this. Respect the silence of the woods. Respect the graves you stumble across, no matter how unmarked, because they are not empty. They are waiting. And when the hour strikes, when the shadows stretch just right, when the mist folds in close, when the compass needle spins, you will hear them. You will feel them. And you will understand, the way I did, that not every trail leads back home. The Great Smoky Mountains breathe. They remember, and at 3:09 p.m., they open their eyes. The silence that followed was heavier than any chant, heavier than the river's roar, heavier than the endless footfalls I'd carved into those ridges. I stood there in the parking lot, the ordinary world bleeding back in. The sound of tires on gravel, the snap of a car door shutting, the hum of conversation carried on the wind. And yet none of it touched me. Not really. It all sounded too thin, too distant, like echoes from a place I no longer belonged to, and maybe that was the cruelest part. You don't just walk out of the mountain, you walk with it. You carry its voice inside you. Its shadow bends behind you no matter how far you run. And though others may look at you and see a survivor, a lucky soul who came back when so many didn't, you know the truth. You didn't escape, you were released, for a reason you'll never understand. I pressed my palms to my face, gritty, with dried mud and blood, and I realized something I hadn't let myself face until then. The mountain doesn't want everyone. It chooses. It marks. Some it buries, some it scatters into rivers, some it pins beneath stones so they sing forever, and some it lets walk away, but only after it has taken something from them, something you can't ever get back. For me, it was certainty. I would never again walk into the woods without feeling that hollow waiting beneath the soil. I would never again step onto a trail without hearing the faint drum of a chant beneath my pulse. I would never again trust daylight as proof of safety. That part of me, the boy who believed the forest was only beauty, only freedom, he was buried in one of those unmarked graves. And maybe that's the lesson I was meant to carry. Because fear in its purest form isn't meant to paralyze. It's meant to remind, to sharpen, to keep us from mistaking silence for safety or mistaking the wild for something tame. It's meant to whisper that the earth beneath us holds more than roots and stone, that it remembers us, even when we forget it. I left that lot eventually. I don't remember walking to the road, don't remember how I got back to where people lived and spoke and laughed without weight in their voices. I only remember the board, the paper, the ink of my name staring back at me, and the way it felt like both a death sentence and a warning to everyone who might come after. So if you hear me now, let this be that warning. Don't take the trails lightly. Don't assume the forest owes you safe passage. And if you stumble across a mound of earth where no marker stands, do not linger. Do not speak. Do not think it forgotten. It remembers. Always. And if you ever find yourself in the Smokies, standing alone at 3-9 in the afternoon with the mist folding low and the compass needle spinning, pray. Pray you're not the one it chooses. Because the mountain is patient, the mountain is merciless, and the mountain does not give back what it takes. And neither will the silence. Listen to me. There are places in this world that will test you, not with storms, not with hunger, not even with predators you can see and fight, but with silence, with shadows, with the weight of your own heart when it beats too loud in your chest. The Great Smoky Mountains are one of those places. They breathe with their own rhythm, one older than any map, older than any hiker's boots or ranger's warnings. You don't conquer them. You don't walk away unmarked. I thought survival was about endurance, about fighting through exhaustion, about clawing past the terror of night until daylight saved me. But daylight didn't save me. The mountain decided to let me go. And that's the truth nobody wants to admit. When you walk into the deep woods, your life is not always your own. You carry it in your hands like an offering. Sometimes it's returned, sometimes it isn't. So carry it carefully. When you camp, when you hike, when you step off the beaten trail, understand what it means. You are entering a place that remembers every footstep, every laugh, every cry. You are writing yourself into something vast and endless. And you don't get to choose whether the mountain keeps your page. You only get to choose how much respect you show while you're there. Respect the silence. Respect the graves, marked or unmarked. Respect the hour when shadows lengthen and the forest grows still, because that stillness isn't empty. It's waiting. And if the time ever comes when the woods close in, when the compass needle spins, when you feel eyes you cannot see, don't let fear freeze you. Let it sharpen you. Let it remind you that life is a fragile, flickering thing, and it is worth fighting for with every torn muscle, every gasped breath, every ounce of will you didn't know you had. Because maybe, if you fight hard enough, the mountain will release you. Not whole, not the same, but alive. Alive to tell the story. Alive to carry the warning. Alive to walk into the world knowing just how thin the line is between laughter on a trail and a name etched into silence forever. Never forget that line. Never forget how quickly it can vanish beneath your feet. And if you hear the chant, if you feel the hour, it means the mountain has opened its eyes. Pray that they close before they fall on you. Breathe. Because if you've made it this far, if you're still hearing my voice, then you understand. This isn't just a story about the Smokies. It's about what waits in every wild place that's bigger than you, older than you, and far less forgiving. The wilderness doesn't care about your plans, your pride, or your certainty. It will strip you down until the only thing left is will. And that's where the truth lives. Out there, when your compass spins and the shadows lean in, you'll learn who you are. Not the name you carry, not the job you work, not the mask you wear when the world is watching, but the raw, trembling, unbroken self who chooses whether to rise or fall. The mountain taught me that survival is not just about making it back. It's about carrying the weight of what you've seen and refusing to let it crush you. It's about standing in the silence afterward, haunted and shaken, and still saying, I am here. I endured. So hear me now, when you step into the woods, carry respect deeper than your fear. Respect the graves you cannot see. Respect the silence that listens. Respect the hour when the trees seem to breathe with you. Because if you don't, the wilderness will remind you in the cruelest way possible. But if you do, if you meet it with humility, with reverence, with the fierce will to keep moving, even when every root and river tries to claim you, then maybe, just maybe, the mountain will let you walk away, changed, marked, but alive. And when you do, Tell someone. Carry the warning forward. Because these stories are not just for the lost, they are for the living, so they never forget how close the dark really is. The Great Smoky Mountains do not forgive. They do not forget. And when the hour strikes, when the mist curls low and the world goes still, they open their eyes. And if you are wise, if you are strong, if you are willing to keep moving no matter what, you will pray those eyes close before they settle on you. Because the mountain always decides, and the mountain never lets go. The fire should have been out by then. I remember staring at it, half asleep in the cold hour before dawn, watching as the last coal flickered, hissed, and finally sank into ash. My breath hung white in the dark, my sleeping bag drawn tight up to my chin, and I knew for certain that I had left nothing burning. I had used every last drop of water from my canteen, soaking the logs, stirring the ashes with a stick, watching the smoke curl upward until there was nothing left but a wet black pit. Yet at 5:52 in the morning, when the silence was thick and the stars over Crater Lake glowed like 1,000 eyes, the fire was alive again. Flames leaping, logs stacked as if someone had rebuilt them, glowing in a way that felt deliberate. It didn't make sense, and that impossibility hit me harder than any sound in the woods ever could. My name is Caleb, 31 years old, raised in Bend, Oregon, and I've camped Crater Lake more times than I can count. I know its ridges, its trails, its moods. I've walked alone along the rim where the wind tries to push you off, where the water is so blue it looks unreal, and I've slept in the backcountry where the ground hums with the memory of the mountain that exploded long before we were born. That night had been like any other. Solo camping trip, nothing but me, my pack, my tent, and the fire I built carefully, the way my father taught me when I was a boy. The rules of fire were simple. Never leave it burning unattended, never assume it's out until it's drowned, and always respect the silence that follows. I obeyed all three. That's what made the morning so wrong. The first thought was rational. Maybe a ranger had wandered by and, for some reason, reignited my campfire. But no ranger would be walking the backcountry at 5 a.m., and no ranger would build the fire into such a neat, symmetrical shape. It was intentional, too intentional. The flames rose in tidy columns. The logs stacked as if someone had been waiting until I fell asleep. And that smell, the air didn't just carry wood smoke, it carried something sharper, almost metallic, like wet iron pressed against my tongue. My skin prickled under my coat, and I realized I was sitting up straighter than I meant to, my hands fisted in the sleeping bag as though bracing for something to announce itself. The sound of Crater Lake at dawn is usually serene. The birds stir, the water below sighs against the crater walls, and the forest wakes with tiny rustles that remind you of how small you are in comparison. That morning, everything was muted, as though the forest had stepped aside to make room for something else. I waited, watching the fire crackle, expecting a voice, a footstep, some hint of who or what had done this. Nothing. Just flames dancing bright and warm in defiance of everything I knew about how the world works. I thought about dousing it again, but my water was gone. I thought about scattering it, but the idea of approaching that fire made my throat tighten. There was a wrongness about it, as if the flames weren't burning wood at all, but something older, something that didn't belong to me or to the forest. The truth is, fear rarely comes as a scream. It comes as hesitation. That second you linger when you know you should move, when your body disobeys your mind because some part of you believes movement will make it worse. I stayed frozen, listening to my own heartbeat. When the wind picked up, it didn't scatter the fire the way it should have. Instead, the flames bent together, leaning inward, forming a funnel of heat and light. The glow spread across the clearing, and for a moment, it looked like the trees were bending too, their shadows pulling toward the fire as if drawn by gravity. My rational brain shouted that it was an illusion, a trick of tired eyes and shifting air currents. But the part of me that had grown up in Oregon, The part that had listened to native stories about spirits in the mountain, about fires that carried messages, knew this wasn't something I could dismiss. I whispered to myself just to break the silence. My own name under my breath, like proof I still belong to this body, this place. But the fire cracked back at me, louder, almost mocking. It was then I realized I was trembling. Not the kind of shaking you do when you're cold, but the kind that comes when your body knows it's in the presence of something beyond explanation. I wanted to believe there was a lesson here, some mistake I had made, some oversight in camping protocol that would explain why my fire had returned. But deep down, I knew it wasn't about mistakes. It was about being seen. Something had noticed me. Something had chosen to remind me that out here in the depths of the forest and the shadow of the caldera, the rules I thought I understood didn't apply. And that's when the whisper came, faint, curling under the crackle of the flames. Not from behind me, not from the woods, but from within the fire itself. My name. Spoken low, deliberate, drawn out as though the syllables were being tasted. Caleb. I felt my spine press against the nylon of my tent, my chest locked in place. My father had always told me that fear was a compass, that it didn't exist to paralyze you, but to point you in the direction of truth. Sitting there, watching the fire rebuild itself and listening to it speak, I realized that truth wasn't always something you wanted to reach. The whisper didn't stop after the first time. It repeated, softer, stretching the vowels, weaving into the rhythm of the fire like it had always belonged there. My name carried on heat and smoke like the forest itself was breathing it. I dug my nails into my palms, forcing myself not to bolt, not to give in to the instinct to flee into the dark. Every survival story I'd ever read, every lesson drilled into me about wilderness awareness, echoed in my head. Don't run blind. Don't turn your back. Don't give the unknown the advantage. But what do you do when the unknown is sitting in your fire pit, wearing your name? My breath became the only sound I could trust. Slow in, sharp out. I tried to convince myself it was exhaustion, a dream masquerading as reality. Maybe I hadn't truly slept. Maybe I was caught in the kind of hallucination that comes when your body is worn thin by altitude and cold. But the smoke carried weight, carried the taste of ash and iron on my tongue, and my lungs burned when I inhaled. Dreams don't sting like that. I reached for my pack, fumbling in the shadows, searching for the knife I kept strapped to the side. My fingers brushed the leather sheath, but when I pulled it free, the blade felt absurdly small in my hand. What good was a knife against something that could bend fire into language? I laid it across my lap anyway. Not for defense, but as an anchor, something solid and human in a moment where both of those things felt like they were slipping away. The fire shifted again, the funnel of flames collapsing into a steady column that rose straighter, taller, brighter. It illuminated more of the clearing than it should have, painting the trees in a light too orange, too steady for anything natural. My eyes caught movement among the shadows, the outlines of the pines bending, swaying, though the wind had died completely. For one terrifying second, I swore I saw a figure between the trunks, not flesh and bone, but flame-shaped, bending and stretching like it was born from the fire itself. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, but when I opened them again, the figure was gone. Only the fire remained, steady, waiting. That was the part that made me sick to my stomach. It wasn't random, it wasn't chaotic. It was waiting. Why me? The words slipped out before I could stop them, hoarse, half a whisper. It wasn't a plea, not exactly, but a question tossed into the void. The answer was silence. Then a spark flared, leaping higher than the rest, and for an instant I thought I saw letters form in the light. Not full words, just the suggestion of them, shapes curling upward and vanishing before I could piece them together. The weight of loneliness pressed down hard on me. I had chosen this trip to clear my head, to be away from people, to remind myself of the calm I always found in the wilderness. But that calm had been broken, hijacked, turned into a stage for something I didn't understand. Alone had shifted from peaceful to perilous, and the thought cut through me like ice. If no one knew where I was, No one would ever know what happened to me. The fear twisted then, transforming into something sharper, anger. At myself, at the fire, at the silence pressing in from every side. I yanked the knife higher, the blade catching the glow of the flames, and I shouted. Not words, not really. Just sound, raw, human sound, as if sheer noise could drown out whatever had invaded my camp. The fire bent. I swear to you, it bent away from me, as if the sound itself had pushed it back. The flames faltered, guttered, and for one blissful heartbeat, I believed it might finally collapse into ash. But then it surged, stronger, the logs hissing as though something invisible had poured fuel over them. My cry died in my throat. And then came the second voice, not mine, not the fire's. From the tree line this time, low, low and deliberate, echoing the first. My name again, but broken, drawn out in a way that made it sound like it belonged to someone else. Cal-Ebe. The trees did not move. The fire did not waver. But I knew then I was no longer alone in that clearing. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to move, but which way? Toward the tree line where the second voice had come from, or away from it, toward the open dark where anything could be waiting. My eyes darted back to the fire, its glow painting the trunks in a halo of orange. For the first time in my life, I didn't trust fire to keep me safe. That realization alone nearly undid me. I stood slowly, the knife trembling in my grip, my boots crunching on frost-hardened earth. The clearing felt smaller than before, like the forest had closed in, inching closer without shifting at all. My breath fogged and lingered, hanging heavy, as if the air itself didn't want to let me go. I turned toward the sound, my ears straining against the silence, waiting for another whisper. But nothing came, only the low hiss of the flames licking against wood that hadn't been there minutes earlier. Logic clawed at the edges of my mind. People get lost here all the time. People vanish in the national parks and no one ever learns why. The locals whisper about spirits that live in the caldera, about voices that belong to those who never made it out. I had always dismissed those stories as folklore, the kind you pass around a campfire to make the night feel fuller, scarier, alive. But standing there, in that half light, I felt the weight of every story I had ignored pressing down on me. I told myself to run, to cut through the tree line, find the trail, and keep moving until I hit the road. But when I tried to step forward, my body hesitated. Not because of fear this time, but because the ground itself seemed reluctant to release me. My boots sank deeper than they should have in the soil, like the earth had softened in the cold. I had to wrench my foot free with a force that felt unnatural. The dirt clung to me, and then I heard it again, a whisper, but not my name this time. A string of words I couldn't understand, guttural and old, slipping through the branches. It wasn't English, wasn't anything I recognized, yet it resonated, as though the sound was meant to stir something buried inside me. The fire flared in time with the whisper, pulsing like a heartbeat. I clenched my teeth and forced myself toward the tree line, step by step, fighting against the drag of the earth. I thought maybe if I confronted whatever it was, it would stop. That was the arrogance of a man raised to believe every mystery could be solved by action. I kept my knife forward, ridiculous as it was, telling myself it was still better than nothing. When I reached the edge of the trees, the air shifted. It was warmer there, though the dawn should have been biting. The bark of the pines gleamed faintly, as if reflecting a fire deeper in the woods that I couldn't see. My stomach knotted. The fire behind me cracked again, louder this time, and I turned to see that it hadn't shrunk in my absence. If anything, it had grown taller, brighter, its light reaching higher into the canopy, swallowing the stars. And then I saw it, a figure, barely there, shaped from the same orange glow as the flames. It stood among the trees, motionless, its edges rippling like heat waves. Too tall, too narrow, its head cocked slightly, as if studying me. My chest locked up. I couldn't make out a face, but I felt its attention, sharper than any stare I'd ever endured. The whisper came again, and this time I understood one word. Stay. I stumbled back a step, nearly tripping on a root. My knife shook, the blade catching a glint of that impossible light, Every instinct screamed that if I listened, if I stayed, I would not leave the forest alive. Yet something deep inside me, something I hated, almost wanted to obey. Because in that moment, the figure didn't feel like a stranger. It felt like recognition. I don't know what kept me from collapsing right there. My legs felt hollow, my chest was tight, and my mind ran in circles so fast it bordered on madness. The figure hadn't moved, but the pressure of its presence was enough to make me feel like I was being pushed backward, like the air itself wanted to drive me toward the flames again. That word, stay, still rattled in my head. It wasn't just a suggestion. It was command dressed in whisper. I forced my boots to dig into the earth, refusing to give ground. My father's voice came back to me then, a memory from years ago on our first solo hike together. The forest will always test you, Caleb. Sometimes it's the weather, sometimes it's the trail, and sometimes it's something you can't name. When it does, you plant your feet and remember who you are. I clung to that memory like a lifeline, repeating it in my mind until the panic began to dull, until I remembered I still had a choice. I lifted my chin, forcing my eyes to hold steady on that flickering figure. No, I muttered, hoarse but clear, my throat scraping raw from the cold air. You don't get to keep me here. The forest responded. The trees shuddered in a sudden wind, though no branches cracked. The figure leaned forward, its shape bending unnaturally, like it was made of smoke stretching toward me. For the first time, I saw movement inside the glow, a flicker of something darker, shapes writhing within it like trapped shadows. The fire behind me roared higher, and I realized it wasn't my campfire anymore. It was a beacon, or a gate, or something worse. I turned, heart pounding, scanning the tree line for a path. I knew the trailhead was north, but in the shifting glow, the forest felt rearranged. Trees I had passed the day before stood in unfamiliar places, the slope of the land tilting at an angle that made no sense. Crater Lake had always been disorienting, a circle of water surrounded by steep walls, but now it felt alive, like the crater itself was trying to keep me inside. I forced myself forward anyway, hacking through low branches with the knife, even though I knew it was useless. Every step sounded too loud, my boots crunching leaves that shouldn't have been there in late autumn, the air filling with the smell of burning pine resin. My own breath was ragged, shallow, loud enough to betray me to whatever followed. And it was following. I didn't have to look back to know. The sound of the whisper moved with me, low and steady, threading through the trees. Not a chase, not hurried, just constant. As if it knew I couldn't escape. I pushed harder, my lungs burning, my legs screaming. Branches tore at my jacket, roots caught at my ankles. The forest seemed endless, each tree a mirror of the last, each clearing leading back into more shadow. My watch buzzed faintly on my wrist, the dawn hour shifting, but the sky above me never lightened. The stars had vanished, swallowed by that unnatural glow still pulsing behind me. I thought I saw a break ahead, a slope that could lead me down toward the lake's rim. Hope surged, bitter and desperate. I stumbled forward, clawing at the bark as I slid down the incline, my boots skidding in the dirt. For one wild second, I thought I'd made it. I thought I could outrun whatever had claimed my fire. But when I reached the bottom, I froze. There, in the hollow at the base of the slope, another fire burned. The same neat stack of logs, the same impossible brightness. And above it, the same figure, waiting. My heart nearly stopped. The fire at my camp hadn't followed me. It had preceded me. The whisper came again, clearer now, curling through the flames as if the figure were speaking with every spark. Stay. And in the reflection of the fire, in the shimmer of the figure's form, I saw something that shattered me. My own outline, my own body, standing in the flame, watching me. My breath caught in my throat, strangled halfway between a gasp and a cry. The shape in the flames, its stance, its tilt of the head, the way the knife glinted in its hand, it was me. Not a vague imitation, not a trick of light, but an exact reflection. My shoulders squared the same way. My chest rose and fell at the same rhythm. When I shifted the knife nervously from one hand to the other, the figure in the fire did the same, perfectly timed, as though mocking my every move. I staggered back, nearly tripping over a root. The flames hissed louder, leaping higher in a burst of orange and white, and then the reflection broke free from the rhythm. While I stood trembling, my double smiled, a slow, deliberate curl of the mouth that I had never seen on my own face before. Something in me screamed to look away, to deny it, but I couldn't. I was locked in, trapped in my own gaze, as if the fire itself had become a mirror, and the thing inside it had taken more ownership of me than I had of myself. "Stay," the whisper came again, but this time it didn't sound like the forest or the figure. It sounded like my own voice, deeper, harsher, but mine. The word echoed in my bones, vibrating against my ribs like a drum. Panic ripped through me, primal and hot. I turned and bolted without thought, clawing through the brush, thorns tearing at my jacket, branches whipping my face. Pain barely registered. I was a creature running on instinct, not reason. I had to get away, had to outrun whatever was wearing my skin in firelight. But every clearing I burst into, every path I tried to carve, led me back to the same hollow, the same impossible blaze, the same impossible version of myself waiting. By the fourth time I stumbled into it, my knees gave out. I dropped into the dirt, gasping, sweat freezing on my skin. My knife clattered beside me, my fingers too weak to hold on. The earth felt soft again, clinging to my palms, almost like it wanted to pull me under and be done with it. I forced myself to look up. The figure still stood there, my face rippling in its glow. But something had changed. Its expression wasn't mocking anymore. It was patient, expectant, like a teacher waiting for a child to stop fighting and finally listen. I shook my head violently, refusing, though I had nothing left to back it up. My chest heaved, my throat raw, my eyes stung from smoke that wasn't really there. "I'm not staying," I croaked, though the words felt small, powerless. The figure tilted its head again, and then, with deliberate slowness, it stepped forward, out of the fire. No crackle of burning wood, no explosion of sparks, just one leg, then another, the glow of its form dimming as it left the flames behind, becoming more solid with each step. My heart hammered so hard it felt like my ribs would split. I tried to crawl backward, but the ground clung too tight, sucking at my boots, my palms. When it reached the edge of the firelight, I saw its face clearly for the first time. It was mine, yes, but older, tired, as if it carried the weight of years I hadn't lived yet. Its eyes were hollow, ringed in shadow, and its lips moved silently before the whisper returned. "You always come back." The ground buckled under me. The air split with heat, and I realized with sickening clarity that this wasn't the first time I'd sat at this fire. And it wouldn't be the last. The words rang in my head like iron striking stone. "You always come back." My body went cold even as the fire's heat pressed against my skin. If this wasn't the first time, then what was I? A traveler in circles? A shadow stuck in some loop carved into the bones of Crater Lake? My mind clawed for logic, for explanation, but the only thing it found was dread. Thick, suffocating dread that no map or compass could ever lead me out of. I dug my hands into the soil, trying to drag myself backward. My nails filled with black dirt, my palms tore on hidden rocks, but still the earth held me like wet clay. My reflection, the older me, or the version that came before, kept walking, slow, steady, patient. Not hunting, not lunging, simply closing the space between us as though time itself had already decided we'd meet in the middle. "No," I rasped, shaking my head. My throat burned, every word scraping raw. "I don't belong to this. I'm not part of this." The figure didn't stop. The fire behind it flared again, and for a split second I saw other shapes inside it. Other versions of me. Dozens, maybe hundreds, blurred together. Different ages, different clothes, but all with the same exhausted eyes. Each one burning, each one silent. I couldn't look at them for long. It felt like staring at photographs of my own death, stacked on top of each other through time. I gritted my teeth and forced myself to stand. My legs shook violently, but rage began to cut through the fear. Rage at the thing wearing my face, rage at the fire, Rage at the thought that I was doomed to repeat a nightmare I couldn't even remember living before. If this is a loop, I spat, lifting the knife again, then it breaks with me. The figure stopped a few feet away, the glow of its form flickering as though uncertain. Its lips twitched into that half-smile again, but there was no mockery in it now. Only something that looked disturbingly like pity. The forest exhaled all at once, a gust of wind tearing through the trees so violently I thought the trunks would snap. The flames bent backward, the coals shrieked, and the sky above me finally began to pale with the first smear of dawn. For the first time since waking, I saw the world outside the fire's circle. Real light, fragile but undeniable. I lunged toward it. The ground tried to hold me, but I tore free, my boots ripping from the soil with a wet suction. My legs pumped harder than they ever had. Knife clutched so tight the handle bit into my palm. I didn't look back. Not at the figure, not at the fire, not at the faces flickering in the flames. I fixed my eyes on that thin strip of gray sky and ran until my chest felt like it would collapse. When I finally stumbled into a clearing, the world was quiet. No fire, no whispers, only the sound of my own breath and the trembling rush of blood in my ears. The eastern sky was breaking open now, streaked with pale gold, the stars fading. I collapsed to my knees, knife still in my hand, lungs heaving. For a long time, I didn't move. I didn't trust that I had escaped, that I wasn't simply standing in another circle, another part of the same nightmare. The silence pressed down, heavy and absolute. Then I smelled it. Smoke. Faint, but there. Curling through the morning air, sharp and metallic, unmistakable. I turned slowly, heart cracking wide open with dread. Across the clearing, no more than 20 yards away, a fire burned. Neat logs, stacked carefully, flames leaping in the pale dawn, and sitting beside it, head bowed, hands fisted in his hair, was me. I stood frozen, my body locked between the urge to charge forward and the instinct to vanish into the trees. The figure by the fire wasn't glowing this time, wasn't some flicker of heat or shadow. It was me in full detail. Same torn jacket, same dirt-streaked face, same knife clutched tight in his fist. He sat hunched, trembling, as though he'd been there for hours. For a moment I thought I was looking at a mirror, dropped into the clearing. But the difference was in his eyes. When he lifted his head, I saw it. The exhaustion, the hollowness. Like he had run every mile I'd just run, felt every terror I had felt, but carried the weight of it for far longer. His lips parted, and I braced for the whisper, for that word I couldn't bear to hear again. Instead, he croaked, barely audible. Don't. Fight it. The fire popped, sparks leaping into the cold air. His words weren't command, not like the others. They were warning, soaked in despair. His voice trembled like someone begging a younger version of themselves not to make the same mistake. And in that instant, my stomach dropped with the sickening realization. This wasn't something wearing my face. This was me. Not ahead, not behind. Parallel. Caught the same way, repeating the same cycle, doomed to watch myself struggle against an enemy that couldn't be beaten. No, I whispered, shaking my head violently, gripping the knife until my hand went numb. I'm not you. I won't. He surged forward suddenly, rising to his feet with a strength that startled me. His eyes locked on mine, wide with something between rage and desperation. You already are. His voice cracked through the clearing, louder than the fire, louder than the wind. Every time you run, every time you scream, you come back. You wake up here. You light it again. My chest constricted. Light it again. The words sank like knives into my gut. I thought of the night before, the way I had built my fire, every log placed carefully, every coal stirred, my father's rules echoing in my head. I had lit it. And what if that act itself was the invitation? What if striking flame in this place wasn't survival but surrender? The other me staggered closer, his face twisted in grief. You can't kill what's waiting. You can't run from it. You can only... His voice broke, and he gestured weakly to the fire, its flames licking higher. Give in. I stepped back, shaking my head so hard it made my vision blur. My legs trembled, not from weakness but from the unbearable pressure of choice. Do I listen to him, to myself, Accept the cycle, sink into it, become another shadow in the flame? Or do I defy it, even if defiance means tearing myself apart, even if it means being hunted forever? The silence between us stretched, broken only by the hiss of burning wood. My double's shoulders slumped, as though he already knew my answer, as though he'd once made it himself. And then, without warning, the forest lit up. Fires erupted in a ring around the clearing, each one identical, each one revealing another me, hunched beside it. Dozens, hundreds, a chorus of faces, each at a different stage of despair, each caught in the same loop. Some wept, some stared blankly into the flames, some smiled with the madness of surrender. The ground shook beneath me, and the air filled with whispers, layered, tangled, all of them carrying the same word: stay. My knees nearly buckled. My knife slipped in my grip. Everywhere I turned, there was only me, failing, giving in, repeating. The weight of inevitability pressed down until it was hard to breathe. But through the roar of voices, one thought cut clear. A lesson my father's voice had left behind, buried under years of silence. Fear is a compass. It points you where you must go, even when the path looks impossible. I looked at the knife in my hand. My heart hammered so loud it drowned everything else. If the fire had been born by my spark, if every version of me had kept the cycle alive by lighting it again, then maybe the only way out wasn't to fight the figure. Maybe it wasn't to run. Maybe it was to turn the blade where no version of me ever had before. I lifted it to my chest, hand shaking, the edge pressing just enough to sting. The whispers surged. The fires blazed higher, and every version of me leaned forward, waiting. The steel against my chest was cold, sharp enough to slice if I so much as breathed too hard. My grip trembled, sweat rolling down my temples despite the freezing dawn. Around me, the fires hissed and cracked, their glow pulsing in rhythm with my heartbeat. The circle of selves leaned closer, dozens of my own eyes boring into me, hungry to see what I would do. Do it, one of them hissed, his voice warped, throat shredded by too many screams. End it. Don't, another whispered, tears streaming down his face. It doesn't matter. You'll still wake up here. The noise built into a chorus, pleading, taunting, mocking, despairing. My own voice layered 1,000 times until I couldn't separate one from another. The weight of it bent me inward, pressing the blade deeper against my chest. My skin broke. A thin line of warmth spread beneath the cold edge. The fire in front of me flared as if eager, waiting for the offering. I wanted to end it. God. I wanted to. I thought about all the people who had disappeared in these woods, how maybe they weren't taken at all. Maybe they had become part of this, stuck in cycles of flame and shadow, until nothing was left but a whisper. Maybe no one ever really left Crater Lake once the fire had their name. If death was the door, then maybe I'd finally walk through instead of circling forever. But another thought split through the madness, clear and defiant. They want me to believe that. What if the cycle wasn't broken by surrender, but by refusal? Not running, not fighting, not killing, just refusing to play the part they laid out for me. My father's words struck again, fierce and alive in my head. Remember who you are. I lowered the knife, slowly, deliberately, even as every version of me screamed, some in rage, some in terror, some in laughter. The ground shook harder, fires bursting higher, shadows writhing in the flames. The figure that had first stepped out of the fire appeared again, its form taller now, more solid, more angry. It pointed at me with a hand like burning coal, its voice echoing over the chaos. Stay. The command thundered through my bones. My knees buckled. My body wanted to obey, to collapse into the soil and wait for the fire to consume me. But I forced myself upright, chest heaving, knife clenched tight. No, I said, louder than I thought I could. My throat cracked, but the word held. I won't. The clearing exploded with noise. The fires shrieked, every version of me howling in fury or despair. The figure lunged forward, a blur of flame and shadow. Instinct took over. I hurled the knife into the heart of the fire. The effect was immediate. The flames convulsed, sucking inward as though starved of air. The figures around the ring staggered, their forms rippling like smoke caught in wind. The ground heaved, and for one blinding moment, the clearing was filled with light, so white it erased everything. Trees, shadows, even the versions of myself. When the world snapped back, I was alone. The fires were gone. The clearing was empty. The soil beneath me was solid, cold, nothing more. My chest rose and fell in silence, my knife nowhere to be seen. The sky had brightened into true morning, gold spilling across the rim of Crater Lake. Birds stirred in the branches above, their songs fragile but real. I staggered to my feet, unsteady, every muscle quivering. My mind reeled, struggling to believe in the stillness, in the absence of whispers. I waited for the voice, for the glow, for the figure to emerge again. But only the sound of wind through pine came back to me. For the first time since 5:52 a.m., I thought I might actually be free. But when I turned to shoulder my pack, I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, half buried in the soil, lay a single matchbook, damp from dew, edges curled. The logo faded, but unmistakable, the kind sold at the Crater Lake Lodge, 20 miles from where I stood. And scrawled across the cardboard in handwriting that was undeniably mine were two words: light it. I stared at that matchbook as though it were a rattlesnake coiled at my feet. My pulse hammered in my ears, drowning out the birdsong, drowning out the wind. Every fiber of me wanted to kick it into the brush, bury it under soil, pretend it wasn't there, but my name was written in that familiar scrawl. My hand had shaped those letters. The evidence was undeniable. I had been here before. My throat went dry. The memory was gone, scrubbed clean, but the proof lay in the dirt. How many times had I crouched in this clearing? How many times had I struck a match, fed a flame, and sat waiting for dawn to come, only to wake in the same nightmare again? Hundreds? Thousands? The faces in the fire hadn't been visions. They'd been records. Footprints in a loop of my own making. The matchbook was damp. It shouldn't have lit at all. And yet I knew that if I picked it up, the sulfur would flare to life in my fingers as though the fire had been waiting, as though it had been patient all this time for me to take my place again. No, I whispered, stepping back. My boots ground into the dirt. I won't, not this time. The forest pressed in, hushed, listening. My whole body shook as I turned, forcing one foot ahead of the other, breaking into a stride that became a run. Every instinct screamed that the matchbook would follow, that it would reappear in my pack, in my pocket, in my hand, that the fire would find a way to spark again. But I didn't look back. I broke through the tree line, down a slope, across a stream that soaked my boots. The rim of the crater rose ahead, the morning sun spilling across it in golden fire, a real fire that did not whisper, did not command. For the first time all night, warmth felt like salvation, not a trap. When I reached the overlook, gasping, my legs trembling with exhaustion, I dropped to my knees. Crater Lake stretched out below, vast, still, impossibly blue. The caldera walls glowed in the sunrise, ancient and indifferent, as if nothing strange had ever happened in their shadow. I wanted to collapse into the dirt and weep, but instead I laughed, a raw, broken laugh that tasted like smoke on my tongue. I never went back for my pack. I never retrieved the knife. I left it all behind, scattered in that clearing like offerings. To this day, I can't say if I escaped or if I simply stepped sideways into another turn of the circle. Every dawn since, when the world is quiet and the air is cold, I hear the faintest hiss of sparks behind me and my skin prickles with the memory. But I've made a vow. I will not light a fire at Crater Lake again. Not with matches, not with flint, not with anything. Because I know the truth now. The danger isn't in the wilderness, it isn't in the shadows or the whispers. It's in the simple act of striking a flame in a place that remembers. And when the forest speaks your name, when the fire rekindles without your hand, sometimes the only way to survive is to walk away, even if it means never knowing how many times you've already burned. So if you camp at Crater Lake, remember this. Drown your fire well, and when the last coal fades, do not linger. Do not wait for dawn. Leave before the silence bends toward your name, because some flames are not yours to tend. And if you ever wake, to find your fire alive again at 5:52 in the morning, know this: someone's already waiting on the other side of it.